Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Freeman Jack on tnsradio.ning.com and Scottish Sovereigns on the Land.ning.com. As usual this evening, we'll be discussing adult topics with perhaps marginally adult language. You might want your granny out of the room. Here we go. Starting off already. I should have a red on air light, really, just so that this... Yeah, it's alright, Mike. We'll just stand at the bottom of the stairs and shout, why don't you? It's alright, Goose. No problem. Jesus Christ. Year and a half on air and he still doesn't bloody know it. Anyway, where was I? Not that that puts you off at all. It's always bloody him as well. Why is it always Michael? You git. Anyway. The noisy one of the bunch. Right, I actually managed to sort out a blog to send out. Blimey, 25 minutes to 9. And I'm actually blogging. I actually knew what the hell I was going to talk about. I tend to find that the sort of ebb and flow of the stuff that I come across has the most remarkable synchronicities to it sometimes. And I don't know whether this is merely the focus of my my intended sort of research is throwing a light on all sorts of other subjects, or whether it's actually that this kind of synchronicity is more a sort of a package of the way that the digital media work and the way that the various sort of search algorithms turn up stuff according to your previous searches, which is pretty ubiquitous and unavoidable now. Jibiru is probably the only way to avoid that I've found. It's a Google-like search engine, but uses the Google algorithm, but without all the personalised part of it. So it doesn't sort of pre-select for your location or previous searches, which can be useful. But anyway, I have been trying to do some more investigation into kind of solar photovoltaics, solar direct air heating, various kind of wood gasifiers. Can't really say I've been doing a lot more research into heat engines, because I've pretty much done, as far as I can see, pretty much all that there is to do. I've actually got AC Crenshaw's heat engines on the shelf there, which has been a book in my possession and one of my cherished possessions for probably about 25 years. Read the thing cover to cover several times. Fascinating book, certainly one if you ever see it on a bookshelf. It's a very demure looking book, but incredibly key info in there if the shit hits the fan, you know what I mean. It's incredible source of data on calorific values of various fuels, of pretty much every type of bloody fuel, to be quite honest. Designs for heat engines, turbines, water pumps, all manner of things, temple doors. In case you didn't know, Grecian temple doors were actually one of the very first ever primitive heat engines, and they relied on the altar fires, not the altar fires, the altars placed outside of the temple doors with brass bowls with hot charcoals thrown in them, which the priest would come out, stick charcoals in there, get the thing stacked up in the morning, and the heat from that would inflate a pig's bladder, which would lift the weight, which was the counterbalance for the mechanism to hold the temple doors shut. And through a system of kind of ropes and pulleys, this counterbalance weight would then be transferred to opening the doors. And so by lighting the fires, the priest would mystically appear to open these enormous, like sort of 10 ton stone doors without ever going anywhere near them. Ooh. Magic. And we actually got a lot of this in the ancient world. Flying chariots in the temples that were merely kind of like a wired contraption of some sort. All sorts of, potions and powders being flung around for their flashy effect. If we were to view the majority of kind of ancient religions and their ceremonies through modern eyes, we would see them quite clearly as a rather lame magician's trick. I suppose one could say that they were kind of displaying the most sort of modern science of the time, as most of that would have come from the realms of sort of Hermetic science. But even so, certainly wouldn't look anything like what we would. Was this about an oil tank? About an oil tank. You're on about Mahatma. Oh, right, oil tank yank. Oh, for God's sakes. Oh, that's going to be later. I've got, who is it? Jeremy Rifkin, I think. Just a recording from him lined up for later on. Let me just drag that out. I'll let you know what I'm going to be playing. Oh yeah, Jeremy Rifkin is a Yankee economist, supposedly a mate of Al Gore's, and from what I can gather, this kind of rather exclusive discussion at this conference would appear to be a whole bunch of kind of like CEOs, and it's not you and me sitting in this conference, and I'd just like to use it to illuminate how some of the clearer thinkers, even amongst the political elite and the corporate elite, are actually sort of starting to realise that the back's up against the wall and they've got to do something pretty damn quick about it. And this guy just, I think, gives a really, again, I'll give a prelude to it before I play it, because there's all sorts of stuff in it that I'm really not entirely happy about, and I've considered whether or not to play it. But I think it's key that we listen to these people. I mean, this is something that I spend a lot of my time doing, is not necessarily viewing the alternative media. If is all you ever consume is one branch of media, then you are essentially excluding yourself from a proportion of the data that's out there. And so I tend to accept data if it comes across as realistic to me from whatever source it comes from. And this came out of, like I say, this sort of pursuit into environmentally sound energy provision. And also, what really got me thinking on this was New York State being out of power after this hurricane, and this being primarily down to the heavy reliance on what Jeremy Rifkin later will be going on to describe as elite energy sources, that essentially centralised large-scale energy sources, regardless of whether they are nuclear, coal, wood, solar or wind, requiring large-scale transmission systems, are prone to collapse. The maintenance and support of such a wide-scale system leaves it open to wide-scale catastrophes. Anything from planes crashing into key switching stations to earthquakes, volcanoes, bloody hurricanes, or even a solar storm brought down the New York power grid all the way up into Canada, and blew so much of the switching equipment with the power surge that it created that they didn't know even if they were going to be able to restore the system. The issue with these wide-scale, high-tension, as it's called, power transmission systems is that they require vast voltages, enormous voltages. I think the national grid runs at 200,000 volts, and 200,000 volts is an enormously energetic voltage to use. This is why the pylons have to be so tall, because if they were any closer to the ground, the ground would literally suck the power out of the cables, because they've got such a huge field around them. And the issue with this is basically it's like running water through a pipe. That if you want to get water down a very long pipe, you have to put it in at a very high pressure at the front end to be able to get it out through the resistance of the pipe. So essentially, the national grid is run at this vastly inflated voltage, much higher than any industry or domestic supply would ever require, and it's reliant on insulators. Because of this, ceramic insulators, and also lots of transformers when you're stepping down from 200,000 volts to get from the grid voltage to your mains voltage of 240 volts. You need vast arrays of step-down transformers, and essentially, if the grid is affected on a wide scale by natural events, that the items that are actually damaged, as well as obviously the cables, but generally speaking the cables can be re-erected and restrung fairly easily. It's these insulators, the ceramic insulators and the transformers that are usually actually the parts of the system that get hit the worst. And the problem with these components is not only are they very heavy engineering dependent and infrastructure dependent, but also the infrastructure that currently supports the manufacture of those components does so on a need-only basis. So basically it works to supply and demand, and obviously a 100-year storm is not going to be catered for within that sort of natural commercial flow of supply and demand. So should we have wide-scale destruction to any major power grid, that the collapse will be painfully difficult to repair and replace. And I might add that in the context of peak oil, again, a point reflecting Jeremy Rifkin, he doesn't refer to peak oil in this video, but he does refer to peak oil per capita. And I really like that concept. I hadn't come across that at all. But peak oil per capita is quite easily calculatable by dividing the amount of oil drawn out of the ground by the amount of people. And he states quite clearly in this video that 1979 was peak oil per capita, and that the financial collapse of 2008 was kind of like the backwash, the financial backwash, catching up with us from having reached peak oil. This being the case, that all of this infrastructure is fossil fuels based, so the actual infrastructure that makes the infrastructure that supports wide scale, high tension energy distribution is itself dependent on the fossil fuels and the infrastructure that is driven by those fossil fuels. And so in any large-scale disaster, these are going to be the most difficult systems to be able to maintain. And what this guy's going to go on and talk about later is how we need to go from these large centralised energy production systems to smaller and smaller, more and more local scale and locally distributed energy production systems. I've been looking really heavily into the cost benefit analysis of things like photovoltaic solar panels, and I would suggest that the market has finally come to a point where it is economically viable. In fact, it's actually almost an economic necessity, with the rise in carboniferous hydrocarbon-based fuel systems on just an exponential cost path at the moment. Any amount of renewable fuel, renewable energy that you can put back into your personal energy circuit will simply start paying for itself as soon as it's plugged in. The cost here is definitely an issue. I mean, you are not going to recoup the cost immediately, but the point being is that if we can promote the need for this to be done across the board to our neighbours, especially to our neighbours, and it may even be that if you get together with a group of 4 or 5 neighbours, that you may well be able to get a group discount over the installation of the equipment if you can't install it yourself. If one of you is a fairly keen, I mean, you would only have to be a moderate electrician and a moderate with moderate DIY skills, as it were, to be able to install these kits. To actually put a PV panel up on a roof is merely a matter of knowing how not to make the roof leak in the way that you mount it. The wiring in, it's a low voltage circuit. Excuse me. It's a low voltage DC circuit on the line from the photovoltaic panel to the switch box in the mains. You don't want that run to be too long because, again, losses can be quite serious in long runs and low voltage. And you can either use it to charge a battery of batteries, and then use an inverter to use this to supply your energy and basically switch between battery-powered inverted power for your mains and domestic supply. And the other alternative is to actually have a system by which you feed directly into your mains through an inverter at all times. The advantage of this second system is, first of all, you remove the sort of hazardous and difficult to maintain at times lead acid batteries out of the equation, plus the losses due to storage and recovery and inversion. Inversion basically is a term describing the conversion of direct current, low voltage direct current to an alternating current 240 volt for your mains. Essentially, you're looking at 300 quid for a starter system. This is going to get you probably about 150 to 180 watts. Now, that is not a great deal. You're only going to get that during the hours of daylight. You'll only get a full capacity on a clear day. So your duty cycle from a 180 watt panel would be approximately 100 watts for 12 hours of a day. So this is the equivalent of merely, one light bulb being used for less than half the day, which isn't a great deal, and it is still quite a bit of an expense. But if you were to gather together with a group of you and equip, say, 4 houses together, with the 4 houses together, you've now got a significant group wattage. Okay? With that group wattage, you can cater for things like high draw, high current devices like kettles and washing machines, and as long as you're not all using them at the same time, it would actually be possible to power your little group of houses from that batch of solar panels. So although the actual kind of wattage return is fairly low, these photovoltaics, essentially, I've never known a photovoltaic to stop working. It's a solid state device. As long as you point light at it, it gives out voltage. As long as it's not damaged by extremes of weather or physical damage, it will carry on working. So we need to start thinking long term. We need to start thinking energy return for energy input. And one of the things that I've actually been looking into is, rather than the conversion of sunlight into electricity, which is a hugely inefficient, the best photovoltaics currently are running at about 18% efficiency, so a hugely inefficient way of converting energy. Perhaps a better way forward would be with either solar water heating which in this country would seem to be a rather foolhardy thing. You would think that most of the time it's too bloody cold outside to heat your water, but with vacuum evacuated frames where there's no air to transmit heat back the other way, or to at least reduce the amount of heat flowing back the other way, and curved reflective collectors, parabolic collectors, making sure to maximise all of the light harvesting availability. You can actually, even in very northern climes, I've seen some sort of Canadian and Finland systems doing this, where even on a, they come out and brush the snow off of this solar water heater and fire it up, and within 2 or 3 minutes it's putting out water at 40 degrees C, and within a matter of an hour or two the water's flowing through the thing at 60 degrees C and at quite a significant rate. So really we've got to think about the fuel efficiency, not only of the production, the output of these devices, but also how costly they are to produce, and how labour intensive and how materials intensive. I've seen some pretty neat stuff being done with old Coke cans. Basically just stack a whole bunch of old Coke cans in a frame with their tops and bottoms knocked through with a sort of screwdriver, stack them all together with a little daub of silicon to make them into a thin airtight tube, and then by basically stacking these tubes into a circuit where the air has to enter into the tube at one end of the frame and travel the entire length of the tube to the other side of the frame, which, if you've got 20 tubes of aluminium cans stacked together across the frame, makes a significant path for the air to have to go through. And just with a small photovoltaic, sort of 3 volt, 5 volt photovoltaic cell in the corner of the thing, driving a DC brushless computer fan that basically you're able to duct significantly beneficial sort of heating grade heat air, which would be perfect for running into, say, an underfloor system, or if you've already got one of these sort of central air-conditioned heating systems in your house, or you can just blow it in through the bloody window and warm the house up from there. Obviously wood stoves for heating are simply the most practical as far as actual, reliability, heat output, availability of fuels, etc., etc., etc. But on the availability of fuels, the cost of buying firewood is exorbitant, and I would suggest possibly one of the most expensive ways of heating your house. So if you're considering going to a wood stove, only consider it if you have an availability of suitable burnable materials that you don't necessarily have to pay bloody wood stove log prices, because it's an absolutely crucifying market out there. I'd dread to think what our bloody wood consumption would cost us if I didn't go out and steal it. Find it. There is a handy one I use in this. Estovers is our ancient right to gather firewood on our Lord's land. So basically, wherever I am, I know that it's going to be owned. The area is going to be owned by some bloody landlord or other. So I just temporarily declare my allegiance to that particular landlord and happen to be gathering my firewood on my liege's property, like a good serf should. It's not construction timber; it's within the law. You're allowed to gather wood for your the needs of your heating, cooking, and domestic construction. So for things like making sort of chairs and stuff like that, and fences, hurdles. Right, let's stick a tune on. A bit more vinyl. Right, I'm going to play this Jeremy Rifkind out because I want to talk a bit more about the. Oh, Debbie, I hope you were listening about the solar panel stuff. Again, I've been, like I say, been doing a lot of research, plenty of different ways to approach it. And if you want to talk seriously about sort of attempting to get some renewable energies, some self-reliant energies into your own place, it's really kind of very location specific as to which source of energy you might be best going for. Like I say, that bloody drinks can thing is a real key idea that I'm going to be looking into. I think that's probably a bit of a it wouldn't need to be used drinks cans. I think that possibly just black plastic drain piping in the same situation would be cheap and effective enough. And as far as I know, things like black PVC drain pipe are largely made out of recycled plastics these days anyway. Black plastic is one of those that they can use high levels of recycled plastics in. So you might be looking reasonably environmentally friendly, even going with that as a source material, as a new material, as a so-called new material. Yeah, anybody else as well that's really seriously considering this? Wood stoves, solar panels, steam generation, even just having backup petrol generation. This is another thing that is easy to do as a community but difficult to do as an individual. Petrol and diesel electric generators are very expensive for a single individual to buy a big enough one to run their entire house. But like I say, this is essentially because of the maximum capacity draw that your house will put onto that demand, whereas it's actually not so difficult to buy a much larger generator which will be far more fuel efficient in the long run, that can power, say, 2 or 3 houses, 3 or 4 houses. And again, it may need a little bit of a rotor for when you can run your washing machines and when you can run your tumble dryers and all of your various sort of high draw appliances, because you wouldn't be able to put all of those on all at the same time. But this is what you have to understand the cyclic nature of the current draw, the wattage that you're drawing from the system from your house at any given time. That's one thing that bloody smart meters would actually be useful for, because it gives you a real time kind of view of your energy consumption at any given moment, which allows you to kind of walk around the house and switch things off and see what sort of an effect it has. Whereas on the old style kind of whirly-twirly mains things, it's not so easy to see. I mean, you can look at the little red dial, which gives you the kilowattage, and sort of see it speed up or slow down. I don't think I've even got that on my meter. I think we've only got the whirly-twirly thing. So, no chance of guessing it here, but it's multiple kilowatts most of the time. Which kind of makes me a bit of a hypocrite on this stuff. I do at least have my wood stove that I rely on. Central London, not the best of places to be doing free energy. Unless it's stolen, like somebody was suggesting through the loft from your neighbours. There's plenty of that sort of free energy being used in South East London, I can tell you. A number of weed grows that rely on that shit. Anyway, right, look, we've got this high-level economist, this Jeremy Rifkind. Yes, I'm sorry, he's a Yank. My apologies for keep bringing Yanks to the bloody airwaves. I know their bloody nasal tones are a real pain in the arse. But this is a talk called The Empathic Civilization. And what he's suggesting here, I think, is really key. Now, I know that it's wrapped up here in globalism, global corporatocracy, that is obviously completely bought into the climate change as a result of CO2 levels argument and the sea level rise argument. Like I say, he does say that he's a mate of Al Gore's, so you know what I mean. They're all up at each other's arses. But the thing that I really wanted to bring to the air with this guy is that not only, like I say, if you write off the parts of what he's saying that we know to be misleading or possibly even just downright wrong, and just listen for his key kind of points here, I think this man's got something really interesting to say. And from the perspective of, you know what I mean, Zbigniew Brzezinski's the biggest threat to the New World Order is the rapid awakening of the political masses. Well, I would suggest that what this pod is actually illustrating is that the biggest threat to the New World Order is the political awakening of the political bloody elites. Because if they're getting to hear this sort of stuff, I mean, this hadn't received an awful lot of views on YouTube, you know what I mean? I know it's up there on YouTube and it's out there in the public domain, so it's not going to have ended up there by accident. But just have a listen. I've played this through about 3 or 4 times over the last week, really racking my brain about whether or not to bring this to air. But no, damn it, I'm going to bring this guy to air and just see what you think of what he's got to say. Because I think this, like I say, if you remove the onion skins of climate change according by CO2 and, you know what I mean, the whole kind of globalist thing, he's really not saying that at all. So I don't know. See what you lot think.
In the world, and I teach CEOs. They have to suffer through. They come back when they're 40, 50 years old, and they have to suffer through 6 weeks. And the first thing I say to them is you have to understand the basic economy of the planet is photosynthesis. That is the basic economy. Everything derives from that. Now, we human beings, we are the youngest species on this earth. We're the babies. We've only been here as anatomically modern humans for about 175,000 years. As a species, we represent less than 1/2 of 1% of the entire living biomass on this earth. We're now using 24% of all the photosynthesis on this small planet. And we're going from 7 billion to 10 billion people in 40 years. If I do the numbers, that means we're going to be using over half the photosynthesis. We are monsters. We are literally devouring this little earth. So either all the other species will go and then we will go, because we live in an interconnected and indebted planet, or we will go. Or we have to change the way we live on this earth. I just don't see any alternative. Let me take you back to July 2008. You recall that month, oil hit $147 a barrel on world markets. And what happened? Prices went through the roof. And the reason they went through the roof is our whole civilization is built off the buried carbon deposits of the Jurassic Age. It's not just our petrol and our light and power, electricity. Our food, by and large, is grown in petrochemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides. Virtually all of our pharmaceutical products are still based on fossil fuels. All the construction materials that make up the infrastructure of the civilization are fossil fuel based. Most of our clothes, our power, transport, heat, light, all of this is embedded in carbon deposits. And so when oil went over $100 a barrel, prices went up. When it hit 147, there were food riots in 40 countries. And remember, the purchasing power of the entire civilization stopped. The industrial machine, after 2 centuries, turned off in July of 2008. That was the earthquake. The collapse of the financial market 60 days later was the aftershock, because we could no longer maintain the fiction of that we were living on a productive, sustainable economy, when in fact we've been living off credit and debt since the early 90s, and American purchasing power was keeping the world afloat, but it was all based on debt and depleting our family savings. We couldn't keep that fiction when the real economy went south. We're still dealing with the aftershock. Our world leaders aren't dealing with the earthquake. This is peak globalization. I think we will look back at this moment of July 2008 as the end game. We now know the outer limits of how far we can travel on fossil fuels in an industrial civilization. And the reason this has happened is because of something called peak oil per capita. Do not confuse this with peak oil production. They're different things, but related. Peak oil production is a geology term. It refers to the classic Hubert bell curve in geology, where half of the world's oil reserves are used up. When half of the known oil reserves are used up, we can't afford the rest of the industrial age because the prices are too expensive. There's controversy about peak oil, but it's narrowing. Pessimists say we may peak somewhere between 2010 and 2020. A few of the majors said we've already peaked, some of the really major consultants. Some of the optimists think that oil, maybe we've got until 2020, 2030, but really it doesn't make any difference at this point who's right. The pessimists and the optimists, they're now arguing about 10, 15, 20 years. How do you remake civilization with a new energy infrastructure in one generation? But that isn't why we hit peak globalization at 147 a barrel. It's because of something called peak oil per capita, and there's no controversy about this. It actually occurred in 1979, at the peak of the auto age. If we distributed all the oil reserves that we knew we had in the world at that time to everyone that was alive on the planet, that's the most each person could have if we distributed it rather equitably. We found more oil since then, but population rose quicker, and demographics is sometimes history. So you see where I'm headed. When China and India made a bid at an amazing 10% growth rate, they burned up the industrial age by bringing a third of the human race into the game overnight. The demand pressure on the limited supply of oil reserves was too great, and at 147 a barrel, the engine turned off. It's an end game. Now, you know that we are starting to grow a little bit because we're replenishing inventories that are depleted. But what's happening? Oil's going over 80 a barrel. And what I said to my colleagues, and you watch this, I think this is going to happen. Every time we try to regrow the economy, the demand will go up because the developing countries are coming in. Prices will go up after 100 a barrel, and 150 will keep short-circuiting it out and keep boomeranging back to a collapse. They're going up, back to the collapse. We can't get through that wall. That is an end game. Fast forward to December 2009, Copenhagen. So our government leaders come together from 192 countries. After 20, 30 years, it's actually started back in 1980. You might recall a book I wrote called Entropy, some of you old folks, in 1980. It was the first book on climate change. We had no clue at that point. But 30 years later, our world leaders come together in Copenhagen, and they try to address the entropy bill for the industrial age, the spent CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, from 200 years of using those deposits in the carbon era. We had a great short-lived civilization, but now the entropy bill comes due. Any engineers here? You cannot escape the second law of thermodynamics. The entropy bill, this is not metaphor, it's coming due. Spent CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, industrial induced. So the United Nations Panel on Climate Change, fourth assessment report, 2,500 scientists, 125 countries, biggest public project in science and history, 20 years of modeling, and they tell us we may see a 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature on this little planet in this century of your kids and grandchildren. Now, that doesn't sound so bad, 3 degrees. But let's put this in perspective. If we go up 3 degrees in this century, your century, that takes us back to the temperature on Earth 3 million years ago in the Pliocene. Completely different ecosystems. And the key is different hydrological cycles. It's actually all about the water. For every 1 degree Celsius that the temperature rises on this planet, listen to this, the atmosphere absorbs 7% more precipitation for every single degree we go up. So we've gone up 1 degree now. And so what you're seeing is more violent weather, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, wildfires, and then longer periods of drought. Imagine when we go up 2 degrees, another 7% absorption of precipitation in the atmosphere in 3 degrees. If we go 2 to 3 degrees, and that's looking optimistic that we can even keep it at that level, our scientists say that we could lose on the bottom end 25%, on the upper end 70% of all the species of assessed life on this earth by the end of this century. That's a wipeout. We have had 5 waves of biological extinction on Earth in the last 450 million years of life, 5 wipeouts. Every time we had a mass extinction, it took 10 million years to recover the biodiversity we lost. As my wife says, we're not absorbing the magnitude of this. We're sleepwalking, we're diluted, or maybe we're just so young and our neocortex is so small, we just can't absorb this. It's just beyond our thinking processes. But we're going to have to try, because now it's about survival or extinction. It gets even worse. I must say that all of us that have been dealing with this, we all got it wrong for 30 years, because what we continue to do is we all continue to underestimate the speed and acceleration of climate change, because in our linear way, we didn't understand the system's feedbacks. There's so many feedbacks we can't anticipate, can't even model till they happen. To give an example, now we've got Siberia. It wasn't even in the 4th report, except a mention of it. And underneath that ground cover is all covered with frost. And underneath that ground cover is the entire carbon deposits of the pre-ice age, because that was a savanna teeming with plant and animal life. It all got captured quickly. When the temperature shifts on the Earth in major periods, it goes quick, sometimes within 10 years. All that animal plant life captured out of the ground, the frost is melting in an area the size of Germany and France and Siberia. And carbon's coming up, and there's more CO2 there than in all the rainforests in the world. And what we didn't anticipate, around the seabeds, the carbon is mixing, coming up methane, which is 23 times more potent. And in the last 12 months, the journal Nature said it's accelerating 6 times faster than we thought 12 months ago. That's one feedback loop. So finally, I advised the European Union. We went to Copenhagen. We were hoping to talk the U.S. and Canada and the world into mitigating CO2 at 450 parts per million by mid-century. No one even wanted to play the game with us. We were it. But then what happened is James Hansen, who's the chief climatologist for the United States government, he's the head of the NASA Goddard Space Institute, he told us in Brussels, he said, the EU, you've got your numbers wrong. If you think you can mitigate CO2 at 450 parts per million and go up only 2 degrees, the geological record tells you you're just dead wrong. We've never been more than 350 parts per million until the industrial age for millions of years. What the record shows, when the U.S. scientific team went under the oceans, the geological record shows if we try to mitigate at 450 parts per million by mid-century, which no one except the EU apparently wants to do, we go up, listen to this, parents and grandparents, we go up 6 degrees Celsius in this century. When people say this is a seasonal variation, please. The Arctic has been encased in ice for millions of years. We've had open summers. You can kayak in the Arctic in August for 4 years. We haven't had that in millions of years. That's not seasonal. So our world leaders come to Copenhagen. They try to cut a deal on climate change, and it breaks down in complete acrimony. It was a humiliating experience. President Obama, rushing through a door and jamming into the Chinese session, and it was a mess. It was a complete collapse. So here's my question that leads to this book. What's wrong with us? We're stupid. And I think it's even deeper than that. Why is it our business leaders couldn't anticipate the collapse of the industrial way of life the day before it happened and have no idea the day after that that was the problem? They're dealing with the aftershock. Why is it our government leaders, knowing that this may be the greatest crisis that's ever impelled our species, not to mention our fellow creatures, we couldn't cut a deal on climate change? My sense is that the problem lies deeper than coming up with some no global mechanism to regulate the global economy or some targets on carbon. I think what's really wrong here is that all of us, we are living on old ideas about human nature and the meaning of the human journey. So for 1,500 years, the church had the last say on this. The church was very clear about it. Born in sin, this is a fallen world, and if you want salvation, you wait for the next world with Christ. That was the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Enlightenment philosophers challenged those assumptions. John Locke, the great political philosopher of the Enlightenment, said, actually, little babies aren't born in sin. They're born a blank slate, tabula rasa. And what you put into them, you get out of them. Very enlightened thinking. Except he had a little caveat, which he slipped in. He said, there is, however, one predisposition. There's a predisposition biologically to appropriate nature and acquire property. They should have caught him on this. Nobody caught him. I didn't see a critique of that. René Descartes said, actually, human beings are rational and detached creatures. There's a split between the mind and the body. We have to get rid of the feelings that we have because they don't direct us in the right way. And the mind can actually take ideas out of the ether and be rational, detached, and calculating in order to organize the world around us. Adam Smith, the great Scottish economist, said, actually, little babies are born with a drive for autonomy. A drive for autonomy. And we are driven by the desire to pursue material self-interest in the market. His book on moral sentiments, he kind of left behind. Jeremy Bentham, 19th century post-enlightenment, said, actually, little babies are born to seek pleasure over pain. We are a utilitarian creature. Charles Darwin said, no, little babies, in fact, every creature is born with a drive to perpetuate themselves by reproduction. Then Sigmund Freud capped it off. He was really the closure of an age and the beginning of an era. He said, actually, no, little babies are born with insatiable sexual appetite, and their whole life is about extinguishing libido. Okay. Everyone that's had a parent, or everyone that's a parent or grandparent, raise your hand. Please, is this what the baby is? I mean, give me a break as the kids. That little baby's coming out of the womb, and they are either fallen, depraved, and evil. They're calculating, rational, self-interested, utilitarian, materialistic, and libido-driven, pleasure-seeking monsters, actually. You may have a problem with yours. If that's who we are, that's really who we are, we're likely doomed. I just don't see any way that 7 billion people going on 10 billion are going to come together and create an integrated, sustainable, just global society and attend the biosphere as our indivisible community. If that's our nature, we're not going to make it. Is that our nature? Well, you know, we embed it in our parenting, we embed it in our schooling, we embed it in our business and government practice, and then we become what we think we are. But maybe that's a secondary nature. In the last 15 years, there have been some amazing breakthroughs in evolutionary biology, neurocognitive science, and child research development that is actually opening up a new window to what human beings are actually made of at our core. And it challenges all these shibboleths that we grew up with. I'm going to take you back to a little laboratory in Parma, Italy in the early 1990s. Pretty sleepy place. They have an MRI machine on a macaque monkey. And they're watching the macaque monkey open up a nut. And certain neurons light up on the MRI in the brain of the monkey. By sheer serendipity, and this is how science sometimes unfolds, I guess by mistake, a human being walks in the lab right after the experiment and looks at the nuts, is hungry, and tries to open up a nut himself and eat it. The macaque monkey was nonplussed. Who is this invader in the lab? He simply stares at this human while he's doing this and opening the nut. And then the researchers looked at the MRI machine. The same neurons were lighting up when the macaque monkey was observing someone else open up a nut as when he was trying to open it up himself. And they thought the MRI machine was broken. They started putting the machine on other primates and humans, and they discovered mirror neurons. This is just one of many developments. The so-called empathy neurons. Apparently, many primates, elephants, we think, maybe dolphins. We're not sure about dogs. We haven't really looked at this. But humans are born with a biological, soft-wired predisposition to actually experience empathy, empathic distress. For example, if a spider goes up your arm, I get a creepy feeling. If you cut yourself and blood comes out, I'll wince. We take this for granted, but alligators don't do that as far as we know. All right? I mean, this is a way for us to express empathic distress, as if what happens to you, I feel vicariously it's happening to me. Empathy is very strange. It's very complex. It's an ensemble. It's how we create selfhood, how we create the human story, how we socialize, how we imagine time and space. It's everything. When a little baby cries in a nursery and all the little babies then cry, that's empathic stress. They just don't know why they're crying. They have no clue. Around 2 years of age, 2.5, your child learns in the mirror, that's me, self-identity. Then they can start maturing empathy because it goes hand in hand with self-development. So if I know I'm a me, and then I'm with you, and I can feel something, I know it's coming from you and not me. Around 8 years of age, a child learns about birth, life, and death. The little boy or girl learns, I come from mommy and daddy, I have a one and only life, every moment is unrepeatable, and one day I won't be here. That matures selfhood, which goes hand in hand with empathy, because once a child understands that life is unrepeatable, that they're fragile and vulnerable, and any moment they could cease to be, that they have a personal history, changes the ballgame. Then, when we empathize with another, it's the existential sense that you have your own personal history, you're fragile and vulnerable, you're not perfect, and you're struggling to flourish and be, because being alive is pretty tough. Whether you're a human being or a fox in the woods, try to imagine how tough it is being alive every day. The odds are not great. So when I empathize with another, whether it's a human or a companion animal or just an animal in the wild, I can somehow smell the whiff of death, but celebrate their one and only life. So if you figure anyone that you really empathize with, a loved one, a soulmate, a sibling, a child, it's that feeling that that other person is struggling to be, we understand their vulnerabilities, they want to flourish, and our compassion comes to them because we want to celebrate their life, their one and only life. Correct? That's what life is about. We are the most social of animals. The worst thing you can do to someone is ostracize them. We are born to be social. We're born to be intimate. We're born to extend ourselves to larger communities of meaning. We are Homo empathicus. There were some folks, when the book came out, said, oh, Mr. Rifkin, this is a utopian vision. And I smiled because it's the exact opposite of utopia. There is no empathy in heaven. There is no empathy in all the utopias you've ever read about because there's no suffering. There's no mortality. Everything is perfect. Empathy is the opposite. It's based on our vulnerabilities, our imperfections. Have you ever empathized with someone who was perfect? There's no existential feeling we're in this together. Empathy is, I like it as the keystone of civilization, which I think it is, because it's an understanding, gee, in all of our vulnerability, tough being alive, but we whatever this life is, we don't know what it is, but we want to struggle to optimize our full potential. To empathize is to civilize. It's the invisible hand of civilization. Our historians have been looking up the wrong tree for a long time. Because our historians, if you're a history buff, they chronicle pathology. All the bad events, the genocides, the blowbacks, the exploitation, the wars, the conquest, the redress of grievances, the power struggles. Why? Because those are unique. They're novel. They're extraordinary. They're not what we see every day, so they become newsworthy. But then when you chronicle all of history this way, as a pathology, we have a pretty grim picture of the human race. It's embedded in our mind. It depresses our psyche. If that's who we were over history, we would never have made it to where we are even today. We would have perished a long time ago. I remember a quote by George Frederick Hegel 30 years ago. I read it. He said, happiness are the blank pages of history. They're the periods of harmony. So in this book, the historians were not of much use to me, except the social historians, but I went back and looked at narrative. I looked at from the great saga Gilgamesh through the Greek tragedies, the chivalric romances, the novels, all the way to cinema, because that's a history where we understand how we actually develop as social beings. It's a rich alternative history, and I think it's more apropos to actually what we are. So I asked this question. Can we imagine ourselves, apropos to the introduction tonight, can we imagine ourselves extending empathy, which is built into our biology, to the human race as an extended family? To our fellow creatures as part of our evolutionary family? To the biosphere as the indivisible community we're all embedded in? Couldn't we imagine that? If we could imagine it, I think we may have a shot at making it on this planet, because species come and go. If we can't imagine it, how do we get there? 6.8 billion cowboys? Will work. So I asked this question. I knew that consciousness changed over history. We know that the way our brain's wired isn't the way a medieval serf's brain's wired, or a forager hunter 20,000 years ago. So I asked, is there a mechanism in history that can give us an idea of why consciousness changes? Why would it change over history? Does empathy evolve? My sense is that the great changes in consciousness in history occur when two things happen. First, we changed the way we organize the energy of the earth. Because ultimately we live by the energy that bathes this planet. And secondly, we changed the way we communicate to organize new, more complex energy regimes. Because when energy regimes emerge, they create the possibility of creating much more complex and dense living arrangements. They require communication revolutions to manage them. When they come together, energy and communication revolutions, they change consciousness, they change temporal spatial orientation. As the Germans would say, they change Gestalt, they change Zeitgeist, example. And they change empathy. You took cultural anthropology, probably one course like myself. You study foragers and hunters. And you notice I didn't say hunters and foragers. We are foragers and hunters. We're not herbivores, although it would be nice if we could get there. We're not carnivores. We are omnivores. We're designed like the chimpanzees to have mostly fruits and vegetables and occasional kill. Foraging and hunting was the energy regime for 93% of our existence. That was the energy regime. They developed language. Every forager-hunter group in history developed language to socially manage foraging and hunting. Every single forager-hunter society in history created mythological consciousness, without exception. That's amazing, no matter where they were in the world. And empathy only extended to immediate blood ties, tribal, because it was empathic distress. The other tribe over there, not human. Human, not human. When we went to the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations, starting in Mesopotamia, and then Indus Valley in India and China and Mexico, we created these great, huge canal and irrigation systems, which required indenturing thousands of men. We had to set up craft skills to create the dikes, and the royal granaries had to be set up, and the royal roads, urban life. It was civilization. This was so complex, cereal grains became the energy mover: rice, wheat, barley. It was so complex, it required a new communication revolution to manage this new complex civilization. In every single place they created writing, starting with cuneiform in Mesopotamia, India, China, and Mexico, without having any clue of the other regions, independently came up with some form of writing. And all those great hydraulic civilizations created theological consciousness, which challenged mythological consciousness, from the golden calf to a monotheistic God, written down in 10 commandments, the people of the book. Writing and script gave rise to theological thinking in the Middle East, India, China, etc. And empathy evolved because it's the invisible glue that allows us to socialize beyond blood ties to more dense, complex associational ties. So we extend the notion of family. So what happened? Jews all start to see other Jews as family. It's not blood related, it's fictional family, but it extended empathy to the new horizons of these great hydraulic civilizations. Christians started to empathize with Christians as brothers and sisters in first century urban Rome. They called each other brother and sister. That was an amazing change because they had come from their local tribes where there was no I, only a we, and there was no sense of family beyond the blood ties. Muslims started to empathize with Muslims. Let me skip up. 19th century, another communication energy convergence. First generation print technology became very cheap in the 19th century. With linotype and rotary steam power, we could mass produce print really cheap. Around the same time, we introduced public schooling and mass literacy, 1830 to 1880, in Europe and the U.S. and Canada. And that communication revolution created a print-literate workforce to manage the first industrial revolution of coal and steam power. Try to do it with codex. That gave rise to ideological consciousness, sense and sensibility, the Enlightenment, the Romantic reaction. Empathy extended again to the new confines where all these new energy communication regimes allow us to annihilate time and space, bring more people together in more diverse patterns, but they also allow empathy to then extend itself so that there's bonds of sociability. So what happened in the 19th century? All of a sudden there's something called France. It's a fiction. It's a new governing unit. It's the outer bounds of their temporal spatial orientation. Now all French people think that French people are family. There was no France. Now all Germans start to think of Germans as family and empathize with Germans. And the funniest one is Italy, when the first prime minister of Italy in the 1870s in Piedmont said, well, it's a great line, now we've created Italy, now we're going to have to create Italians. And so Italians empathize with Italians. You see where I'm going. So if history has not been linear, there have been so many dark periods, bad eras, downdrafts. But there is kind of a jerky history as we created more complex energy and communication regimes. Consciousness has moved from mythological, theological, ideological. By the way, the 20th century was the most interesting. Another energy communication convergence. We created electricity communication, telegraph, telephone, cinema, radio, then TV. That became the management and marketing tools to organize the internal combustion engine and oil age. That's the age that's sunsetting on life support. And what happened? We went from ideological consciousness to psychological consciousness. Everyone here thinks therapeutically. Grandma and Grandpa couldn't do it. If my grandma was sitting at a dinner table at a family function, and she's getting increasingly uptight, and I'm looking over while no one's looking, she smashes a plate on the floor, and I say, Grandma, I saw that. That was a passive-aggressive act. Something is bothering you. Well, let's talk. Something in your childhood with family get-togethers, you had some bad experiences, you're transferring and projecting your needs onto the rest of the family. Grandma has no clue what you're talking about. Grandma can think ideologically, she can think theologically, she can put a little salt over her shoulder and knock on wood and think mythologically, not therapeutically. But again, empathy then extended to people of like-minded affinity interest. And we had all the great social movements. The women's movement, the feminist movement, the ecological movement, the civil rights movements, the gender movements, etc. So, we've had a jerky history, but we've gone from empathy to blood ties, then associational religious ties, national identity. Is it a big stretch to imagine now stretching the boundaries to the biosphere, a global society in which the human family is considered a family and our fellow creatures part of our evolutionary family? It doesn't seem like a big stretch. Why would we stop right here at a fiction called The National Boundary? There is a paradox in history. It's the empathy-entropy paradox, I think. It's kind of bittersweet, because the problem is more sophisticated energy regimes that allow us to flow more energy through and create more complex arrangements, and communication revolutions that manage them allow us to broaden our consciousness, extend empathy, but they use up more energy. More empathy, more entropy. It's a contradiction. Today, we're in a totally globally connected society. We can actually begin to empathize with the polar bears at the pole. When that YouTube came out of that everyone's nodding, the mother and her cub on the ice floe 2 summers ago, I guess in August, and we knew they weren't going to make it. Everybody empathized with that, not out of some sentimentality or quick entertainment. We knew that's them, they're us. We now can connect. When the Haiti earthquake hit, within an hour, the Twitter came out, 2 hours, the YouTube videos on cell phones, 3 hours, an entire empathic generation, younger generation was there. It was our backyard. This was us. The Portuguese, the Lisbon earthquake several hundred years ago, people didn't know about it for 6 months. When that student, after the Iran protests, after the Iran election, the students took to the streets, and you recall the one young college pre-med student, Nadia, she was gunned down while I guess a friend was taking a cell phone video of her. Within an hour on Twitter, an entire generation of young people were there empathizing, knew her Facebook, knew her family. That is a global consciousness. That is biosphere consciousness. But even though we can sense, and I don't think we're there, we can sense little glimpses of this with all the xenophobia. The reason there's so much xenophobia and populism and blowback is when old civilizations are dying and new civilizations are being born that broaden our sense of identity, our sense of affiliation, our sense of belonging, those old identities are very, very threatened. This has happened over in history, and they can create a implosion. Go back in. Who are these people crossing our borders and our boundaries? Literally and figuratively. So how do we break this empathy-entropy conundrum? We are on the cusp of a new energy communication convergence, a third industrial revolution. I just don't know if we'll get there in time. We had a tremendous communication revolution in the last 10 years, the personal computer and the internet. Now, what's kind of interesting about this communication revolution, it's different than the one I grew up on. I grew up on centralized communication to organize centralized elite energies, top down. This internet revolution is open source, it's collaborative, and the key word you take with you tonight, it's distributed, distributed, distributed. You got a couple billion people that can now send their own video, audio, and text to each other simultaneously at the speed of light with more power than the CBC. This distributed ICT revolution, internet revolution, information communication revolution, is just now converging with a new energy regime, distributed energy. When distributed communication manages distributed energy, we have a third industrial revolution and maybe a shift temporally and spatially to biosphere consciousness. What are distributed energies? Well, let's compare them to elite energies. We're pretty familiar with them. Elite energies are elite simply because they're not in your backyard. Go home tonight, chances are you don't have any coal, oil, natural gas, uranium. I guess if you're in Alberta, you have tar sands, lucky you. But you don't have, these are elite energies because they're only found in certain places, and they require huge military investments to secure them, huge geopolitical investments to manage them, and they're the most centralized energy regime in history. Be clear. I don't have to remind any of us how many millions and millions of people literally have died in wars to secure coal, oil, gas, and uranium in the past 2 centuries. That's the dark side of a great short-lived civilization, incredible civilization. Those energies are sunsetting, their technologies are old, their infrastructure is on life support, and we short-circuited out at 150 a barrel. And we're never, ever going to come back with that second industrial revolution. What are distributed energies? Go home tonight, they're in the backyard. All the energy we need, the sun shines, the wind blows. All of us have geothermal heat under the ground, wherever there's land. If we live in the rural areas, we have biomass, agriculture and forestry waste. If we live in the ocean, on the coast, we have the ocean tides coming in and out. We have hydro. We have garbage that can be redirected to energy. These are distributed. They're distributed because they're found in some proportion in every square inch of the land and water of the earth, more than we would ever need. The European Union has committed itself to a third industrial revolution. I was privileged to develop this game plan with a team, and it was endorsed by the European Parliament in 2007, and we're now trying to move it out in the member states as quickly as we can, given the austerity drives, the debt crisis. We're trying to keep that door open. Here's the 4 pillars. Pillar 1, the EU is committed to 20% renewable energy by 2020. That's a third of the electricity of Europe, way ahead of any standard in the world. That's a mandate, not a benchmark. Got to be done. Every city is scrambling, every area. But then Pillar 2 faced us. How do we collect renewable energy? How do we collect it? The first thought in Brussels was, well, that's kind of easy. Let's go where it is. There's a lot of sun in the Mediterranean. Let's go to Italy and Greece and get the big centralized solar parks and ship it on these big super grids back to the rest of the continent. The Irish have the wind, centralize it, ship it out to Europe. The Norwegians have the hydro. I don't oppose centralized solar and wind, but they're transitional. They're not a third industrial revolution. They're essential but not sufficient. And they're 20th century thinking based on elite energies where they're only found in certain places. You go get them, and then you have to ship them out. And you lose so much energy and electricity along the line that it's a complete waste. So Pillar 2, what we envision in Europe, the EU, and by the way, lest we discount Europe, and I constantly in the U.S. press, Europe's history. Every other day we got some reason, Europe's history. It's China and U.S. Please, reality check. The European Union is the biggest economy in the world. 500 million people, 27 member states, and their 27 states' GDP exceeds the GDP of our 50 states in the U.S. And if you put the U.S. and China together, it's almost matched by the European Union. Okay? But we got problems because the EU is connected to a global society, and we're all sharing these problems. Pillar 2, buildings, buildings, buildings. We envision taking every single existing building in Europe that exists now, office, home, factory, shopping mall, and we're beginning to convert them into partial power plants across Europe. Germany's leading, Spain's leading, Scandinavian countries are coming in quick. Italy's going to be moving quickly this year, other countries. Buildings use a third of the energy, or almost 40%, and 40% of the CO2. They're the #1 cause of climate change. Does anybody know what the #2 cause of climate change is? Yeah, beef production and consumption. #3 is worldwide transport. Yet not one leader in 194 countries has ever made a single statement on the #2 cause of climate change. And President Obama, who we thought was so sophisticated and worldly, every Friday he goes and has a photo opportunity with the vice president eating at his favorite hamburger joint. Now, if he took a Hummer there, it would be all over the internet. Does he not know Even Al Gore, who I deeply admire, I've known him for a long, since the beginning, and I think what he's done is extraordinary, but he never had a single statement on this until he was finally captured on a TV show this year and acknowledges, how serious are we about our own extinction if we can't even change our diet and become what we are, which is omnivores. So, buildings. We imagine converting every existing building to a power plant that captures the sun, the heat, the wind, the garbage around the building. That appreciates the real estate value of Europe, because then we can move, because construction's the elephant in the room. Now our dwellings have a dual purpose. They're now a power plant, which appreciates their value, and it requires millions of people to reconfigure every building over 30 years. And the labor has to be in-country. The new buildings are positive power from scratch. We have the first buildings up in Spain, Navarra, Spain, Acciona, the great construction company. They have a building up there. It's so architecturally sophisticated, it actually produces more power than it needs, sends it back to the grid. And now Bouygues in Paris has an office complex going up, same thing. We got a whole bunch of them in line this year. Payback 7 to 9 years, and we're not even at parity. We'll go down to 3 years for our return on investment. It's here. Pillar 3, we asked ourselves the question, how do we store this energy, because the sun isn't always shining in Ottawa? The wind sometimes isn't blowing, or it's blowing at night. You need the electricity during the day, and you lose it. So Pillar 3, the EU has committed 8 billion euros now to hydrogen storage technology. Hydrogen stores renewables the way digital stores media. We like other storage, too. We like water pumping and flywheels and batteries and capacitors. But hydrogen's got a universal quality to it like digital. So sun hits your roof, right? You got a solar collector. You generate electricity. You have some surplus you don't need. Surplus, you electrolyze water like high school chemistry. And the anode, the cathode, you slept through this class. Look at that. No recognition. These are the humanities crowd. I'm one of you. The anode, the cathode, you slip it into the water, the hydrogen comes into a tank, and then when the sun's not shining, convert it back to electricity. Where are my engineers? So when people say to you, oh, but isn't that an energy loss? Please explain to them, whenever you convert energy, you lose energy. It's the second law of thermodynamics. And if you saw the conversion loss in uranium, coal, oil, gas, getting from point A to point B, consumption, it's through the roof compared to what I've just mentioned. Because these technologies are local, the heat can be regenerated back, and you don't lose anything on the transmission. Then we face Pillar 4, final pillar. And this is where the distributed communication revolution converges with the new distributed energy to give us a third industrial revolution, biosphere consciousness. We take the internet technology, it's identical. We take the power grid of the EU, hopefully Canada, and we transform it in the next 30 years to an intergrid that acts exactly like the internet. So that when millions and millions of buildings are producing just a little bit of their own power, storing it in hydrogen like you store digital media, what you don't need, your software can direct it peer-to-peer across a continent in cooperative social space, energy spaces, just like the Internet's collaborative social spaces. Power to the people. Democratization of energy. Some call it distributed capitalism. Others, it's a hybrid between actually capitalism and socialism, because it requires a strong social market model. That's why Europe is moving quicker on it. Canada could, because with the exception of probably a few areas of Canada, your thinking is much more to the European sensibility. The Brits are much more to the U.S. sensibility. Social market model. That is, it's a lateral stretch in capitalism because everyone's an entrepreneur. You produce your own energy, like you produce your own information. But then it requires collaboration, think internet, so you share it peer-to-peer across entire continents. The reason we can do this, and we couldn't do it before, is because it's something called grid IT. For 30 years, governments would say, Mr. Rifkin, how the hell are you going to run the world on windmills and solar roofs? Get real. We love them. We're going to put them in, but they're soft energy and will just be a tiny portion of the energy we use. You hear this argument all the time. We couldn't actually answer this argument until 7 years ago. Now we can, thanks to our IT friends. The cutting edge of the IT revolution is called IT 2.0 Grid IT. We now have the software developed in the U.S., moving quicker in Europe, though, with industry. We can now connect hundreds of thousands or even millions of little desktop computers that have almost no power. But when you connect them, the distributed power of millions of those computers dwarfs anything you could ever imagine with centralized supercomputers. We can take grid IT to the power lines. When millions of buildings across the 5 continents, each continent, it's continentalization, not globalization. It's continentalization to globalization. When millions of buildings across each continent are producing a little bit, and then what they don't need, they ship out to everyone else, the distributed power exceeds anything you could ever imagine with nuclear and coal-fired power plants. And for a generation that grew up on the internet and Wikipedia and YouTube and file sharing and Facebook, that's used to creating their own information and sharing it in collaborative social spaces called the commons, the idea of producing their own energy and sharing it peer-to-peer across continents is no stretch at all. The generational divide here is no longer it's no longer the old divide of right-left. The new divide is actually generational. It's between those who think centralized, patriarchal, and top-down, and those who think distributed and collaborative and open source. It can be center-right or center-left. It's all generational. I've seen regimes where those who come from the right-wing parties are doing this, and I've seen those from the left who aren't, and vice versa. It's a generational shift. So, this gives us biosphere consciousness. When all of us are responsible for stewarding the part of the biosphere we're in, with the energy that bathes us and the photosynthesis that provides for us, but then we have to share that energy peer-to-peer and collaboratively across continents, we become aware that we are as connected in the ecosystems that make up the biosphere as we are in the blogosphere and the internet and cyberspace. That is biosphere consciousness. It's not academic. Go in any schoolroom in Ottawa, and the teachers are teaching the students that every single thing they do every day, the food they eat, the clothes they wear, the electricity they use, the family car, has a footprint, ecological and carbon, that affects intimately some other family or some other creature somewhere else in the earth, correct? That's all in the last 10 years. It's a revolution, and thank God we didn't know it was. It probably would have been kept out of the schools. This is a revolution in consciousness. This is a change in temporal spatial orientation. Let me finish with that. At some point during the talk, a lot of folks say, oh my God, this old man is standing up there telling us we've got to change consciousness and human nature, the whole planet's going. Hey, give me a break. I just came to the Tulip Festival. I wanted to hear a nice talk about climate change. It's not going to happen. We're all dead. No. Consciousness changes quickly when new energy communication revolutions come along because they change the temporal spatial orientation of the brain. I'll give you an example of some of the things. How many of you looked in a mirror today? Why does everyone laugh and look guilty? I don't get that. It's not about narcissism. You have to groom yourself every day. Would you be surprised to realize that up until the 1400s, nobody saw themselves? Think about this. You could see yourself in a pond of water, kind of a piece of rusty metal, maybe a reflection in the glass, but not very good. Grooming wasn't very good. If some of you have been to Venice, you've gone to Murano, the little island where they do glass blowing. They started blowing mirrors in the 14th century. And these little mirrors were given out with the first books. And so all of a sudden, imagine the first time in history people started seeing this. Oh, holy mackerel. Well, no, I mean, that's me. But what's interesting, this is me. I don't look like you. That's you. You are so different. I can see all of you clearly. Now I can see all of me clearly. And I understand that we are very unique people. But I can also see so many similarities between you and me. This is called self-reflection, mirrors. Introspection. The mirror allowed us to go deep into ourself, deepen our selfhood, deepen our sense of how unique each individual is. I am different from you, but how similar we are. It helped extend the bonds of empathy in the late medieval era, the Northern Renaissance leading into the First Industrial Revolution. In 1969, our boys were coming on their last ride around the moon on Apollo on the dark side, and the spaceship went on the light side. The sun was beautifully bathing the Earth. And you remember the older folks, they photographed the Earth in color from the moon. What did we do? Every poster on the wall for 5 years, right? That was an out-of-body experience. As we become connected, we could see the world, this little beautiful Earth, from the outside in. The kids have it imprinted on their brain with Google Maps every day. A kid may be Skyping in a class here in Ottawa on a school project with a kid in Tokyo. They get to know each other. He finds his address on Facebook, with his address, and he'll take a Google map from outer space and go all the way down to that kid's house and look in the window. From the outside in, from up, down, we can see ourselves. And now through the interconnections with the internet, we can see ourselves connected on the inside out, and now with distributed energy connected from the neck down. This is the shift to a collaborative society. This is biosphere consciousness. This is empathy extended to the human race, Homo empathicus, our fellow creatures. Unless we think this is all going to be rosy and fine, let me remind everyone here that every family in history is dysfunctional. We're not saying because you're family, we all loving each other. Every family is dysfunctional. I'm sure forage or hunter societies were dysfunctional as well, but they realized they were related. Do you follow me? As family. And so when there's crisis, the empathy, because we have a history with each other. Global connection allows us to have a history with a lot more people, a lot more animals, and a lot more of the earth. Can we get there in time? We have just started in Europe. We have a group called the Third Industrial Revolution Global CEO Business Roundtable, which I chair. We started about a year ago. We have 120 companies. Some of you may know about this. We've just done our first 4 collaborative master plans. It's really difficult and challenging. We have the major renewable energy companies, some of the major real estate and construction companies, the major hydrogen companies, the IT companies, logistics, so IBM, Cisco, Kima, Philips, Schneider, Arup. All these companies come together along with the world's cooperatives. We see this as a hybrid of capitalism and socialism. So we brought the International Cooperative Association. At first our company said, what the hell are they doing here? Early adoption, this has to be done with energy cooperatives around the world. So we started our first 4. We just did San Antonio, the 7th largest U.S. city in Texas. We just finished Monaco for Prince Albert a few months ago, and this is the big one. We are just finishing the master plan for Rome, for the mayor. 50-year rollout to create everything I've just said. It's going to cost billions. It's going to roll out on May 31st. And we're just doing Utrecht, the fastest growing region in the Netherlands, fastest growing region in Europe. We're about to do all of Spain for President Zapatero and many others. Germany is now moving. We need to move it in Canada. Then we need to move it in Mexico. And then we surround the United States. And maybe they'll realize, south of the border, what we need to do. I'm very serious about this. I'm in discussions here with your major companies right now. We're in discussions. Hopefully this can start happening. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. How many of you took your National Geographic DNA genetics test? Oh, come on. Nobody's taking your National Geographic? All right. All right, well, I'm going to clue you in on this. My wife and I, my in-laws did this. You give $100 to the National Geographic on their website, and they send you a biological kit. You take DNA out of your cheek, as we did. We put it in the kit and send it back to the lab, and the geneticists analyze our DNA. They send back our results with a map showing, based on our genetic mutations, where our family tree went to, all the way back to the beginning of our migration in history. It's wild. It's wild. But I'm going to save you $100 because there's something else they tell us here that I didn't know. Apparently, if our geneticists are right, it's very revealing. 175,000 years ago, Rift Valley of Africa, there were about 10,000 anatomically modern humans, our ancestors, walking those grasslands. They located, the geneticists, a woman. She's a data line, a database line. They call her the mitochondrial DNA Eve. Apparently pretty fertile. Her genes passed to everyone in this room today. The other ladies didn't make it. It gets even more strange. They located a male, I think it was about 70,000 years ago, data line, database, genetics. They call him the Y chromosome Adam, very potent. His genes passed to everyone here tonight. The other guys didn't make it. Here's the news. 6.8 billion people fighting, xenophobia, cultural, ethnic, gender issues, all of these things dividing us. We all came from 2 people. The Bible got this one right. We could have come from many more. But we are a family. With all our diversity and all of our extensions, we are a family. These are things that change the way we think. We have to think as Homo empathicus. We have to begin to extend the boundaries of the human community to the biosphere because that's what we all live in. That's our survival. We have to think of our fellow creatures as part of our family because they have a right to be here with us or without us. There's a fundamental principle I always keep in my mind that encodes all the human rights and all the other rights we put in the world. We've encoded lots of rights, but there's one at the center we haven't encoded. It's the first right. It's also a responsibility. It's one and the same. And that is every human being here and not yet born, every creature here and not yet born has the fundamental right to their fair share of access to the energy that bathes this small experiment in the universe. Sound right? That's a right and a responsibility, because our responsibility is then to act as stewards to take only what we need and provide for our fellow creatures. Does that sound like a good principle? So, can we get the job done? I have no clue. So many parents with little kids come up and say, can we do it? How do I know? I don't know more than you do about this. But I do know one thing. When we get old, over 60s, I'm 65, and we look back on our life, we realize that the scientists didn't have to tell us about any of this, empathy. When we look back on our life, we don't look back in the great moments photographed in our memories where we were able to outcompete someone with our aggression, or we were able to accumulate some more wealth, or we were able to feel autonomous and an island to ourselves, or, boy, that was a great moment when I felt totally rational, calculating, detached, utilitarian, and my libido was actually extinguished at the same time. That's nirvana. That is not what we look at when we look back on our life. We look back at the moments in our memory where there was that moment where we could feel another as if they were ourselves. That's the ultimate democracy. That's the actual transcendence, is when we can feel another as if it's that other is ourselves. And we feel their struggle to be, and we have compassion and celebrate and root for them as if we're us. Isn't that the moments we remember? Didn't need the scientists to tell us this. We have to focus on our primary drives. If we are homo empathicus, how does it reflect in the parenting? Our school models, our business models, our governance. We can create a third industrial revolution that distributes power, but then we have to distribute our empathy, so that bathes the earth and not our spent energy. If we can do this, we may survive. We may even replenish this earth. We may even have...
Right, yeah, look, I'm going to... what I was saying about kind of my research is a little sample of my YouTubing for the last couple of days. We've got that Jeremy Rifkin, we've got Solveig Coagula, The Great Work of Alchemy, Daniel C. Dennett on What Should Replace Religion, The Quantum Conspiracy, what the popularization of quantum mechanics has done, Inflationary Cosmology on Trial, oh god, then we've got a load of bloody tunes by the kids, then we have Exploring the Large-Scale Nature of the Universe, Leonard Susskind, The World as a Hologram, The Mystery of Empty Space, Magnetism, an Old Phenomenon with new... what's that one? With New Surprises. Just a whole range of stuff. But the thing that has struck me across a lot of these various sort of seminar talks that I've been going through is that these are fairly key scientists. A lot of these people I know of through my kind of browsing of New Scientist and stuff. These are sort of names that have been in their various fields for significant periods of time. And what strikes me with nearly all of those that I watched there was that all of them have something on the tip of their tongue, but they don't know quite what it is. Their fields are so specialised that they haven't quite got the picture yet, but they're so obviously confronted by something that just isn't explained by the mainstream SI model that they're forced into questioning it. And what you tend to find is a lot of slightly embarrassed giggles from these scientists. It's almost like they're presented with this conundrum, this paradigm that isn't modelled within the science that they've been raised in. And it's all, I find myself almost like sort of screaming at the set, you know what I mean? If they could only look outside of their field, they would find all other key scientists also finding material that points to the model that we've been given is hugely inaccurate, flawed model. And I'm going to descend into the woo-woo here. I don't know how much of any of these I'm going to play, but this is just one that I want to get you kind of just a little taste of. This is Stephen Wolfram, A New Kind of Science, in respect to the stuff that I've been ranting on about the fractal holographic universe and how all of the shapes of nature can have spawned out of reiterations of a fractal algorithm that at its source would be very simple and would contain a very limited number of very fixed, rigid rules. And that if we could understand those rules, then we would be able to change the nature of our experience of reality. Well, this guy's a mathematician and a computer sciences bod, and this is very fast delivery. I don't know exactly how well pitched it is. There's not too much maths in there, if you can just kind of, and it's actually quite graphic, so it's hard to necessarily gauge how well it's going to come over as an audio. But just if you can, his kind of enthusiasm, if nothing else, for this subject, and I'll chuck a link to all of these YouTubes in the chat box at the end of the show, so anybody that wants to go off and listen to the whole thing can do at their leisure. I'm incredulous that this one's received 146,000, nearly 147,000 hits, so it can't be that. I don't know. Certainly, in this context, nothing that I've come across before. I've certainly come across this subject, but in the context of artificial intelligence, machine life, codes breaking out of a pre-given set of rules and developing behaviour of their own, which is very much in the sort of substance of what he's talking about here, but he doesn't actually go to that point. But anyway, listen, this is basically about self-evolving number sets and how they are clearly the driving force behind the shapes that we see in nature. Here we go, a bit of Stephen Wolfram for you.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. I'm sure many of you have now seen this big book somewhere. It took me about 10 years to write it, and I'm very proud of it. And actually, by now, I hope some of you at least have had a chance to actually read it. Well, what I want to do here today is to tell you a little bit about what it says. And actually, what I want to do is to tell you about sort of an intellectual structure that I've spent the better part of the past 20 years building. And I think it's a structure that has some pretty exciting implications, both now and fairly far into the future. Well, back in the late 1970s, I was a young physicist, mostly working on particle physics, but I also did a certain amount of work on cosmology. And from that, I got interested in the question of how structures emerge in our universe, from galaxies on down. Looking at that question, I quickly realized that it was actually an instance of a much more general question, sort of how does anything complicated get produced in nature? Well, there are lots of everyday examples: snowflakes, turbulent fluid flows, forms of plants and animals, lots of others. My first assumption was that with all the sort of sophisticated math that I knew from particle physics and so on, I'd easily be able to figure out what was going on with these kind of ordinary everyday systems. When I actually tried to do it, though, it just didn't seem to work, and gradually I started thinking that perhaps there might be a fundamental problem with the whole approach that I was using. Well, if one looks at history, the idea of using math and mathematical equations to understand nature has been sort of a defining feature of the exact sciences for perhaps 300 years. And certainly it worked out extremely well for Newton and friends in figuring out orbits of comets, and for lots and lots of things since then. But when the behavior one's looking at is more complicated, it just doesn't seem to work so well. Gradually, what I began to think was that was actually why there had never really been a good theory for complicated processes in nature, in physics, and particularly in biology and so on. And I got to wondering whether there might somehow be a way to go beyond the usual paradigm of thinking about mathematical equations in thinking about nature. Well, that was around 1981. And it so happened that at that time I had just spent time developing a big software system called SMP that was in some ways a forerunner of Mathematica. And at the core of SMP was a computer language. And what I'd done to design that language was somehow to try to think about all the computations that people might want to do, and then to try to identify primitives that could be strung together to build up those computations. Well, that had worked out fairly well, and in fact in a much evolved form, I think it's now worked out spectacularly well in Mathematica. But anyway, back in 1981, I had the idea that perhaps just as I'd been able to find primitives for computations people want to do, I might somehow also be able to find primitives for what nature does. And the crucial thing that I realized is that those primitives don't have to be based only on traditional mathematical constructs. I mean, if one's going to be able to do theoretical science, one has to assume that nature follows some kind of definite rules. But why do those rules involve only the kinds of constructs that have been invented in human mathematics, things like numbers and exponentials, calculus and so on? Can't the rules somehow be more general? Well, in the past, there wouldn't really have been any systematic way to think about such things. But now we have computers whose programs in effect implement arbitrarily general rules. And the idea I had was that perhaps the kinds of rules that can be embodied in programs might actually be what nature is using. So what sorts of programs might be relevant? Well, from knowing about mathematical things, I'd assumed they have to be at least somewhat complicated. But still, I figured I should at least start by looking at really simple programs. So in practical computing, we're used to fairly long and complicated programs that are specifically set up for particular tasks. But what I wanted to know about were really simple, short programs, say ones just chosen at random. So what do programs like that do? It's sort of the simplest possible computer experiment. You run the simplest programs and see how they behave. Well, back in 1981, I came up with particular kinds of programs to try that are known as cellular automata. So here's how a simple cellular automaton works. One starts off with a row of cells, each either black or white. Then the cellular automaton evolves down the page with the color of each cell on each step being determined by a definite rule from the color of the cell and its neighbors on the step before. Well, in this particular case, the rule is really simple. It just says that a cell will be black whenever it or its neighbors were black on the row before. And what happens is just that we get a simple uniform black pattern. Well, we can use that icon at the bottom there to represent the rule, the program that we're using. So what happens if we change the rule a bit? Well, now instead of getting just a uniform black pattern, we get a checkerboard. So far, none of this is terribly surprising. We're using very simple rules, we're getting simple patterns out. Okay, let's try another rule. It's the same setup as before, but what's going on here? We don't seem to be getting any kind of simple repeating pattern. Let's run it a bit longer. It gets pretty intricate. We can see, though, that it's very regular. It's just a self-similar or fractal pattern, just formed from identical nested pieces. Well, one might think that if one has a simple rule and one starts from just a single black cell, then one would always have to get a pattern that's somehow very regular, like this. At least back in 1982, that's what I assumed was true. But one day I decided to try a very systematic experiment and just run every single one of the 256 possible simplest cellular automaton rules. So when I got to rule number 30, this is what I saw. So what's going on here? Well, let's run it some more. Well, there's a bit of regularity over there on the left, but otherwise this looks really complicated, actually kind of random. Well, when I first saw this, I thought it might just be a problem with our visual system, that really there were regularities, but we just couldn't see them. So I ran all sorts of elaborate mathematical and statistical tests. And what I found was that no, so far as I could tell, something like the center column of cells here really was perfectly random. Well, this is rather amazing. We have a very simple rule. We're starting off from a single black cell, but what we're getting out is an incredibly complicated pattern. It seems in many ways random. So it just doesn't seem right. We put so little in, yet we're getting so much out. It's not what our ordinary intuition says should happen. I mean, in our everyday experience, and say in doing engineering, what we're used to is that to make something complicated, we somehow have to start off with complicated plans or use complicated rules. But what we're seeing here is that actually even extremely simple rules can produce incredibly complicated behavior. Well, it took me years to come to terms with this phenomenon, and in fact it's gradually overturned almost everything I thought I knew about the foundations of science, and it's what's led me to spend the past 15 years building a new intellectual structure, really a new kind of science. Well, okay, so having seen Rule 30, what more can happen? Here's another one of the 256 simplest cellular automata. This is Rule 110. So this one grows only on the left. What's it doing? So let's run it a little bit longer. It's not making any kind of uniform randomness. Instead, we can see little complicated structures running around. You can ask, what's going to happen? Well, the only way to find out seems to be to just keep running the system. Are we going to get more of the little structures, or are they all going to die out? What's going to happen? Well, after 2,780 steps, we finally get the answer. At least in this case, we basically end up with just one structure. But it's kind of amazing, everything we get, just starting from one little black cell and then following a really simple rule. Well, in the mid-1980s, I'd studied a bunch of cellular automata, and I'd seen these basic phenomena. But I wasn't sure whether they were somehow specific to cellular automata or more general. And I had the practical problem that there wasn't any easy way to set up all the very different types of computer experiments that I'd have to do to find that out. In fact, that was one of the main reasons that I started building Mathematica. I wanted once and for all to make a system that I could use to do all the computations and all the computer experiments I'd ever want. Well, for 5 years, the task of building Mathematica in our company pretty much consumed me. But finally, in 1991, I decided I could start looking at my questions in science again. Actually, it was really incredible. Things that had taken me days to do before now took minutes. It was easy to do all the experiments I wanted. I mean, I guess it was a little how it must have felt when telescopes or microscopes were first invented. One could just sort of point them somewhere and almost immediately see a whole world of new phenomena, like little microscopic creatures swimming around in pond water and so on. Well, in the computational world, one just pointed Mathematica somewhere and suddenly one could see all this amazing stuff. So the first question was, just how special are cellular automata? Well, I looked at lots of cellular automata and often saw very complicated behavior. What about programs with different setups, though? Like, here's a Turing machine, for example. It's got a row of cells like a cellular automaton, but unlike a cellular automaton, only one cell gets updated at each step, but that cell moves around. Well, the first quite a few Turing machines only do these kinds of things. But if one keeps going, still with very simple rules, then suddenly one sees this. The same kind of complexity that we saw in cellular automata. So what about other kinds of programs? Well, I looked at many, many different kinds. Sequential substitution systems that rewrite strings like an iterated text editor. Register machines, kind of like minimal idealizations of machine language. Also symbolic systems like generalizations of combinators or kind of minimal idealizations of Mathematica. It's the same story in 2 dimensions, in cellular automata or in Turing machines, or for that matter in 3 dimensions. Every time one sees the same thing, even with very simple rules, one can get extremely complicated behavior. One doesn't even need rules that specify an explicit process of evolution. Constraints work too, like here's the simplest set of tiling constraints that force a non-periodic pattern. And here are constraints that give a kind of crystal that's forced to have a Rule 30 pattern. Well, wherever one looks, it's always the same basic thing. Incredibly simple rules can give incredibly complicated behavior. It seems to be a very robust and very general phenomenon. But so how come something that fundamental hadn't been known for ages? Well, partly it's because one can only easily see it by doing lots of computer experiments, and it's only with computers, and particularly with Mathematica, that those have become easy to do. But more important is that with our ordinary intuition, there just didn't seem to be any reason to try the experiments. It seemed so obvious they wouldn't show anything interesting. Well, now that one's made the clear discovery that simple programs, simple rules can produce complicated behavior, one can go back and find all sorts of hints about it from really long ago. I mean, nearly 2,500 years ago, for example, the Greeks looked at prime numbers. And there's a fairly simple rule, a fairly simple program for generating all the primes. But the sequence of primes, once generated, looks remarkably irregular and complicated. There's also a fairly simple rule for generating the digits of pi. But once generated, that sequence looks to us completely random. And actually, there are lots of cases of this kind of thing with numbers. I mean, here's what happens if you write out successive powers of 3 in base 2, kind of a minimal version of a linear congruential random number generator, and already amazingly complicated. Well, you can also make very complicated sequences from simple integer recurrences. And here, for example, is the simplest primitive recursive function that has complex behavior. Well, what about other systems based on numbers? What about, for example, those favorite things from traditional mathematical science, partial differential equations? Does their continuous character make them work differently? Well, the ones people usually study show only rather simple behavior. But doing an automated search through the space of possible symbolic equations, I ended up finding these creatures. They're just simple nonlinear PDEs, but even with very simple initial conditions, they end up doing all sorts of complicated things. Oh, actually, it's a little hard to tell exactly what they do. I mean, we use these PDEs to test our ever-improving state-of-the-art PDE solving capabilities in Mathematica. But with continuous systems, there's always a problem, because you end up having to discretize them, and without already more or less knowing the answer, it's hard to tell whether what you're seeing is something real. That's probably why, among mathematicians, numerical experiments can sometimes have kind of a bad name. But in a discrete system like Rule 30, there are no issues like that. The bits are the bits, and one can tell that one's seeing a real phenomenon. Actually, I think Rule 30 is so simple to set up, there's really no reason the Babylonians couldn't have done it. And I sometimes wonder whether a bit like these, some ancient mosaic of Rule 30 might one day be unearthed. But I rather think that if Rule 30 had actually been known in antiquity, a lot of ideas about science and nature would have developed somewhat differently. Because as it is, it's always seemed like a big mystery how nature could manage, apparently so effortlessly, to produce so much that seems to us so complex. I mean, it's like nature has some special secret that allows it to make things that are much more complex than we as humans normally build. And often it seems like that must be evidence that there's something somehow beyond human intelligence involved. But once one's seen Rule 30, it suggests a very different explanation. It suggests that all it takes is for things in nature to follow the rules of typical simple programs. And then it's almost inevitable that, like in the case of Rule 30, their behavior can be highly complex. I mean, the way we as humans are used to doing engineering and to building things, we tend to operate under the constraint that we have to foresee what the things we're building are going to do. And that means that we've ended up being forced to use only a very special set of programs that always happen to have simple foreseeable behavior. But the point is that nature is presumably under no such constraint. So that means that there's nothing wrong with it using something like Rule 30, and that way inevitably producing all sorts of complexity. Well, once one starts thinking in terms of simple programs, it's kind of amazing how easily one can start to understand the essential features of what's going on in all sorts of systems in nature. So let's talk about a simple example, snowflakes. Crystals start by grow by starting from a seed and then successively adding pieces of solid. And one can try to capture that with a simple two-dimensional cellular automaton. I mean, imagine a grid where every cell either has solid in it or not. Then start from a seed and have a rule that says solid will be added at any cell that's adjacent to one that's already solid. So here's what one gets. It's an ordinary looking faceted crystal here on a square grid. Well, one could do the same kind of thing on a hexagonal grid. But for snowflakes, there's obviously an important effect missing here. And what that is that when a piece of ice solidifies from water vapor, there's some latent heat released, and that inhibits more ice from solidifying nearby. Well, what's the simplest way to capture that effect? One can just change the cellular automaton to say that ice gets added only if the number of neighboring cells that are already ice is exactly 1. Okay, so what happens then? Well, here's the answer. And these are all the stages that one sees. And these look an awful lot like real snowflakes. It really seems like we've captured the basic mechanism that makes snowflakes have the shapes they do. And we get various predictions, like the big snowflakes will have little holes in them from where arms collided, and so on, which indeed they do. Okay, but even though the pictures we've got look a lot like real snowflakes, there are obviously details that are different. One thing one has to understand, though, is that that's always going to happen with a model, because the whole point of a model is to capture certain essential features of a system and to idealize away everything else. And depending on what one's interested in, one may pick different features to capture. So the cellular automaton model is good, for example, if one's interested in the basic question of why snowflakes have complicated shapes, or what the distribution of shapes in some snowflake population will be. But it's not so useful if one's trying to answer a question like specifically how fast each arm will grow at a certain temperature. I might say that there's actually a general confusion about models that often seems to surface when people first hear about cellular automata. They'll say, okay, it's very nice that cellular automata can reproduce what snowflakes do, but of course real snowflakes aren't actually made from cellular automaton cells. Well, the whole point of a model is that it's supposed to be an abstract way of reproducing what a system does. It's not supposed to be the system itself. I mean, when we have differential equations that describe how the Earth moves around the Sun, we don't imagine that inside the Earth there are all sorts of little mathematicos solving differential equations. Instead, it's just that the differential equations represent abstractly the way the Earth moves. And it's exactly the same thing with models based on cellular automata. I mean, the cells and rules abstractly represent certain features of a system. And again, what abstract representation, what type of model is best, depends on what one's interested in. In the case of snowflakes, there are certainly traditional differential equations that could be used, but they're complicated and hard to solve. And if what one's actually interested in is the basic question of why snowflakes have complicated shapes, the cellular automaton model is a much better way to get at that. Okay, let's take another example. Let's talk about fluid turbulence. So whenever there's an obstacle in a fast-moving fluid, the pattern of flow around it looks complicated and quite random. But where does that randomness come from? Well, one can ask the same question about randomness in any system, and I think there are really three basic ways that randomness can arise. The one that's traditionally most talked about is that the randomness can come from external perturbations, from the environment. I mean, an example is a boat bobbing on an ocean. The boat itself doesn't produce randomness. It just moves randomly because it's exposed to all the randomness of the ocean. It's the same kind of thing in Brownian motion, where the randomness comes from lots of microscopic molecules randomly bouncing around. Or in electronic noise, where one's listening to much amplified random thermal motion. Well, in the last 20 years or so, another way to get randomness that's often been talked about is the one from chaos theory. And the idea there is not to have randomness continually injected into a system, but instead to have it fed in only at the beginning from the details of the initial conditions for the system. So think about tossing a coin or spinning a wheel. Once it's started, there's no randomness in how it moves. But which way it'll be pointed when it stops depends sensitively on what its initial speed was. And if it was started, say, by hand, there'll always be a little randomness in that. So one won't be able to predict the outcome. Well, there are more elaborate versions of this where one's effectively taking numbers that represent the initial conditions for a system and successively excavating higher and higher order digits in them. And from the perspective of ordinary continuous mathematics, there's some trickiness in accounting for where the randomness comes from there. Looked at in terms of programs, though, it's very clear that the randomness one gets out is just randomness that one put in the detailed pattern of digits in the initial conditions. So again, this ends up being an explanation that says essentially randomness comes from outside the system that one's looking at. Okay, well, so is there any other possibility? Well, it turns out that there is. Just look at Rule 30. Here one doesn't have any randomness initially, one just has a single black cell, and one doesn't have any subsequent input from the outside. But what happens is that the evolution of the system just intrinsically generates apparent randomness. Okay, so what about fluid turbulence? Where does randomness come from there? Well, with the traditional differential equations way of modeling fluids, it's very difficult to find out. But one can make a simple cellular automaton model where it's much easier. Well, so remember that at the lowest level, a fluid just consists of a bunch of molecules bouncing around. And actually we know that the details aren't too important because air and water and all sorts of other fluids that have completely different microscopic structures still show the same continuum fluid behavior. So knowing that, we can try to just make a minimal model for the underlying molecules, just have them, for example, on a discrete grid with discrete velocities and so on. Well, if one does that, one both gets a rather nice practical way to do fluid dynamics, and one can start addressing some fundamental questions. And what one seems to find is that there's no need for randomness from the environment or randomness from initial conditions. One can get randomness from intrinsic randomness generation from something like Rule 30. Well, okay, so what? If one's trying to make models of fluid turbulence, it's kind of important to know where the randomness in it comes from. And intrinsic randomness generation makes at least one immediate prediction. It says that in a carefully enough controlled experiment, the turbulence should be exactly repeatable. See, if the randomness comes from the environment or from details of initial conditions, it'll inevitably be different in different runs of the experiment. But if it's like Rule 30, then it'll always be the same every time one runs the experiment. Well, one can ask about randomness in all sorts of systems, like in finance, for example, where the most obvious feature of almost any market is that the prices in it seem to fluctuate quite randomly. So where does that randomness come from? Some of it is surely from the environment, but some of it is probably intrinsically generated, and knowing that is important if you want, for example, to know if you can predict it. Well, back in physics, one place randomness has been discussed a lot is the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy increase. A lot is known about it, but there's still sort of a basic mystery about how the laws of physics can be reversible, yet in our everyday experience we see so much apparent irreversibility. And I think that intrinsic randomness generation finally gives one a way to explain that. It's a slightly long story, but it's basically that things like Rule 30 can so encrypt the data associated with initial conditions that no realistic experiments or observations could ever decode it and see how to go backwards. Well, okay, that's a little about physics. What about biology? Well, there's certainly a lot of complexity in biology, and people often assume that it's kind of a higher level than in physics. And usually they figure that somehow because of adaptation and natural selection. But in reality, it's never been clear why natural selection should actually lead to much complexity at all. And that's probably why, at least outside of science, many people have thought there must be something else going on. The question is, what is it? Well, I think that actually it's just the abstract fact that we discovered with Rule 30 and so on, that among simple programs it's actually very easy to get complexity. I mean, of course, the complete genetic program for a typical organism is pretty long and complicated. For us humans, it happens to be about the same length, for example, as the source code for Mathematica. But it's increasingly clear that lots of the most obvious aspects of forms and patterns in biology are actually governed by rather small programs. And looking at, for example, these kinds of regularities that one sees in biological systems, that doesn't seem too surprising. When one sees more complicated stuff, though, traditional intuition tends to suggest that somehow it must have been difficult to get. And that, for example, with the natural selection picture, there's sort of the idea that it must be the result of a long and difficult process of optimization, or of trying to fit into some complicated ecological niche. Well, I actually think that that's not where many of the most obvious examples of complexity in biology come from. I mean, natural selection seems to be quite good at operating on small numbers of smooth parameters, lengthening one bone, shortening another, and so on. When there's more complexity involved, though, it's very hard for natural selection to operate well. And instead, what I think one ends up seeing is much more just the outcome of typical randomly chosen genetic programs. So let me give you an example. Here are some mollusk shells with pretty complicated pigmentation patterns on them. Well, in the past, one might have assumed that to get things as complicated as this must be difficult, and that somehow it must be the result of a sophisticated biological optimization process. But if you look at these patterns, they look incredibly similar to patterns we get from cellular automata, like Rule 30. Well, in the actual shell, the pattern is laid down by a line of pigment-producing cells on the growing edge of the shell. And it seems that what happens can be captured rather well by a cellular automaton rule. So why one rule and not another? Well, if one looks at different species, one sees all sorts of different patterns. But the neat thing is that there are definite classes of patterns that one sees that correspond remarkably well with the classes of behavior that one sees in cellular automata. So it's sort of as if the mollusks of the world are just sampling the space of possible simple programs, and we just get to see the results of those programs displayed on their shells. Well, with sort of all the emphasis on natural selection, one's kind of gotten used to the idea that there can't be much of a fundamental theory in biology, and that the things one sees in current organisms must just reflect detailed accidents in the history of biological evolution. But what the mollusk shell example suggests is that things might actually be different, and that instead it might be reasonable to think of different types of organisms as somehow uniformly sampling a whole space of possible programs. So let me give one more example. Shapes of leaves. One might think that these are too diverse to explain in any uniform way. But actually, it turns out that there's a simple type of program that seems to capture almost all of them. It just involves successive repeated branchings. And what's remarkable here is that the limiting shapes one gets look just like actual leaves, sometimes smooth, sometimes jagged, and so on. Well, here's a simple case where one can actually lay out all of the possible shapes that one gets. And one thing one can see is that varying a parameter can change not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively what kind of leaf one gets, and therefore also potentially change how it can function biologically. Well, to be a little more sophisticated, one can kind of summarize features of possible leaves in a parameter space set that turns out to be a rather interesting, simpler, linear analog of the Mandelbrot set. And from the properties of this set, one can deduce all sorts of features of leaves and their likely evolution. Well, okay, there's a lot to say about how one can use ideas about simple programs to capture what's going on in biology, both at the macroscopic levels of the kind I've been talking about and at molecular levels. Let me now turn for a few minutes back to physics, and in particular fundamental physics, for which we don't immediately need a picture. Well, traditional mathematical approaches have obviously had lots of success there. But still, they haven't been able to give us a truly fundamental theory of physics. And I suspect that the reason for that is that one really needs more primitives, not just the ones from traditional mathematics, but also the more general ones that one can have in programs. And now that we've seen that very simple programs can produce immensely rich and complex behavior, one can't help wondering whether perhaps all of the amazing things that we see in our universe couldn't just be the result of some particular simple program. Well, that'd be pretty exciting, to have a little program that's a precise ultimate model of our universe, so that if one just runs that program long enough, it'll reproduce every single thing that happens in our universe. But okay, what might such a program be like? Well, one thing that's kind of inevitable is that very few familiar features of our universe will immediately be visible in the program. I mean, there just isn't room. I mean, if the program is small, there's no way to fit in separate identifiable pieces that represent electrons or gravity or even space or time. And in fact, I think that if the program is going to be really small, it sort of has to have the very least possible structure already built in. And for example, I think a cellular automaton already has far too much structure built in. For example, it's got a whole rigid array of cells laid out in space. And it also separates the notion of space from the notion of states of cells. And I don't think one even needs that. I mean, in ordinary physics, space is a kind of background on top of which matter and everything else exists. But I think that in an ultimate model, one needs only space. I don't think one needs any other basic concepts. Well, okay, so given that, what might space be? I mean, we normally think of space as just being something that is, not something that has any kind of underlying structure. But I think it's actually a little like what happens with fluids. I mean, our everyday experience is that something like water is a continuous fluid, but we actually know that underneath it's made up of lots of little discrete molecules. And I think that something similar is happening with space, and that at a small enough scale, space is just a huge collection of discrete points. And actually, I think it's really a giant network with a changing pattern of connections between points, where all that's specified is how each point, each node is connected to others. Well, in the end, there'll probably be lots of ways to formulate it, but a simple one is just to say that each point is connected to exactly 3 other points, making a trivalent network. Well, okay, so how can anything like space as we know it come from this? Actually, it's quite easy, and in fact, one can have networks that correspond to space in any number of dimensions. I mean, here are some examples. This is 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions. What's important here is that all these are just trivalent networks. The only thing that's different is the pattern of connections between the nodes. Well, I've drawn these to make the correspondence with ordinary space clear, but it's important to realize that there's absolutely no intrinsic information in the actual network about how it should be drawn. It's just a bunch of nodes with a certain pattern of connections. Well, okay, given a pattern of connections, how do we tell whether it corresponds to 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, or whatever space? It's actually quite easy. Think about starting at a particular node, then go to all nodes that take 1 connection to reach, then 2, then 3, and so on. Well, what one's doing here is to form some kind of circle or sphere or something. And then the thing to do is just to ask how many nodes there are inside that after one's gone, say, R connections. Well, in 2 dimensions, it would be roughly the area of a circle, pi r squared. In 3 dimensions, the volume of a sphere, 4/3 pi r cubed, and so on. And in general, in d dimensions, it would be something that grows like r to the d. So given a network, that's how one can tell how many dimensions one's in. Okay, well, so that's a little bit about space. So what about time? In the usual mathematical formulation of physics, space and time are always very much the same kind of thing. I mean, just different variables corresponding to different dimensions. But when one looks at programs, they seem much more different. I mean, in a cellular automaton, for example, one moves in space by going from one cell to another. But one moves in time by actually applying the cellular automaton rule. Okay, so can space and time really be that different? It's all rather tricky, but I think that at the lowest level they are. I mean, it's definitely not like in a cellular automaton, though, because in a cellular automaton there's some kind of global clock, with each cell getting updated in parallel at every tick. Well, it's hard to imagine how such a global clock could exist in our universe. Okay, so what might actually be going on? Well, here's something that at first seems crazy. I mean, how about if the universe works like a Turing machine, or what I call a mobile automaton, where at each step there's only one cell that's getting updated? So that there's no problem with synchronization here, because there's only one place where nothing happens at a time. But so how can this possibly be right? I mean, after all, we normally have the impression that everything in the universe is going through time together. I mean, I certainly don't have the impression that what's happening, for example, is that first I'm getting updated, then you're getting updated, and so on. But the point is, how would I know? Because until I'm updated, I can't tell whether you've been updated or not. Well, okay, so if one follows this all the way through, one realizes that all we can actually know about in the end is a kind of causal network of what event influences what other event. And here's an example of how one can go from an underlying sequence of updates, in this case in a mobile automaton, to a causal network. And the important thing here is that even though the updates only affect one cell at a time, the final causal network corresponds to something kind of uniform in space-time. Okay, so how might time work in the context of the space networks that I talked about before? Well, the obvious thing is to imagine that there's an updating rule that says that whenever there's a piece of network that has a particular form, it should get replaced by a piece of network with another form. So here are examples of rules like that. There's an immediate problem, though. I mean, if there are several places in the network where a particular rule could apply, where should one update first? In general, different updating orders will lead to different causal networks, and one will get a sort of whole tree of possible histories for the universe. And then to say what actually happens in our universe, one will somehow have to have more information to say what branch one's on. Well, I don't consider that very plausible, and it turns out that there's actually another rather subtle possibility. It turns out that with the appropriate kinds of underlying rules, it actually doesn't matter what order they get applied in. There's what I call causal invariance. That means that the causal network one gets out is always the same. Well, for those of you who know about such things, this is related to the so-called confluence or Church-Russell properties in rewrite systems. It's also related to the way that Mathematica manages to find canonical forms for expressions. But anyway, there are conditions about avoiding overlaps and so on, which turn out, for example, to allow rules based on graphs like these. And whenever one uses just these graphs, for example, one has causal invariance, and that means that in a sense there's always just a single thread of time in the universe. Well, okay, in addition to making there be a single thread of time, this setup has another important consequence. It turns out to...
That was a slightly foreshortened Leon Pythian's Keep On Believing We Are Free there. Yeah, that was a new kind of science by Stephen Wolfram. Like I say, I'll chuck all the links to all these in the chat later, but I think you'll agree that essentially what he has stumbled upon in his Mathematica, this Mathematica is essentially like black and white squares on a graph paper and applying numerical algorithms to their behaviour in their interaction with each other, and like I say, spawning all sorts of natural forms. And like I say, these guys have obviously realising that this is something that kind of goes against the grain of the assumptions that are made in a lot of the kind of paradoxical mainstream sciences, but is quite literally going to throw a light on the underlying matrix that drives the kind of stuff and substance of reality that we experience, and it's looking decidedly like a digital code, exactly what Tom Campbell describes as the digital virtual reality, that we are literally decoding reality as a digital code. Interesting subject. Another subject that I've stumbled upon, I've always had a fascination with cosmology. Physics dives into this, quantum physics dives into this certainly, and light speed is a particular bugbear of mine, especially since they quantified the meter as a particular number of wavelengths of a particular colour of orange light. Now the issue that I have here is that when you use that particular measurement to measure something like light speed, then when light speed is measured in meters per second, if the meter is a unit of a certain frequency of light, then you have a circular measurement. In engineering, this is just something that you wouldn't do. This is something that you would avoid in measuring something by its relation to the variable. This doesn't give you a measurement. This simply gives you a ratio, in effect. So, any claim that light speed is a constant is simply because distance is a constant fixed to light speed. So if light speed now varies, the very tools with which we have to measure it in this cyclic ratio of the unit of measurement. So it will always remain constant. It cannot change within that system. So it's a meaningless measurement. It may well make all of their mathematics work and all the rest of it, but like I say, that's more indicative of the 10 to the minus 46th of a second frame rate that Tom Campbell has identified as the kind of shutter speed of this digital transmission. That would be the equivalent of your 100 kilohertz, 100 kilobit network connection, or your gigabit network connection. It can pass 1 million bits per second. In this case, the 10 to the minus 46th of a second allows in a second so much data to be transmitted that it would be beyond human ken to be able to absorb it all. So that doesn't detract in any way from reality. But anyway, and again, I'm kind of rushing because I want to get a bit of this one in before I'm done. And this is a cosmologist, again, totally stuck in the mainstream. He's almost incredulous at himself. And again, you get these kind of roars of laughter from the audience of cosmologists that have come to see this man. They just don't get it. He's what I've described for many, many years now is my observation through watching the scientific media and stuff like Sky at Night, BBC's Horizon, was that there was this incredible correlation between the predicted observations of scientific instruments in astronomy and cosmology and the actual received data. And you just don't get this in engineering. I grew up around engineering. You statistically predict a mechanism's functionality, and you'll get to within a 15% swing would be a bloody good hit rate for a human endeavour, with all of the variabilities that are involved. But to get this constant, I would hear time and time again Patrick Moore currently there, often the Arecibo instrument has returned an incredible closeness to the predicted statistics, and within a 98% accurate, 98% that you could explain that away in noise in the instrumentation that they were using. Background noise. So essentially, the predicted observation has been essentially 100% of the observed observation. And just having seen it, it always struck me that don't they realise that what we're actually seeing here is our projecting of the universe out into reality, that our ability to determine it and to measure it and to observe it actually projects it out there, and that what we observe as the expanding universe could quite literally be explained by our increasing ability to observe the universe is literally pushing it out like a reality bubble. It's not an easiest one to get your head around, but there it is. That's what it's looking like. And this guy here obviously has no idea of that implication, but the data that he's presenting is quite clearly showing that the cosmology that he is studying is pointing to exactly that the only conceivable way that these coincidences could possibly be encompassed in any logical, rational sense would be to suggest that they're not coincidences. And if they're not coincidences, then what the hell are they? Anyway, this is Lawrence Krauss, Life, the Universe and Nothing. And this is, what's he called? I can't remember what the little tablet is that he's got up on screen here, but it's the death of everything or something it's got on screen. But yeah, no, listen to the stuff that he's got to say, and listen to the data points, and just think of it in context and what I was just saying. This is another interesting one.
But empty space isn't so empty. So therefore, we should be able to calculate the energy of empty space. And when we do, we're a little embarrassed, because we come up with the following prediction. The energy of empty space should be roughly a gazillion times the energy of everything we see. That is the worst prediction in all of physics. Okay? Probably. I don't know if Ray made any worse ones, we predict that the energy of empty space should be roughly 120 orders of magnitude larger than the energy of everything we see. And that's a problem. In fact, it's so big a problem that we thought we knew the answer when I was a graduate student. We just said, well, make it zero. And we were able to go to sleep at night. We were sure the energy of empty space was zero, but we now know it's not. It's an absurdly small amount compared to this. It's 120 orders of magnitude smaller than our prediction, but not zero. And we don't have the slightest reason or understanding why. It is the biggest mystery in physics. If anyone comes up to hear you and says they understand why, they're lying. Especially if they're a string theorist. Okay? We think its existence is probably tied to the beginning of the universe, and the key thing is it will determine our future. And that's what I want to spend the next few minutes talking about. How our picture of the future has changed because of our understanding that the dominant stuff in the universe is nothing. And by the way, this makes us even more insignificant than we were 15 minutes ago, right? Because before we were relatively insignificant compared to dark matter, but now us and everything we see is less than 1% of the total energy of the universe. We really are just a little bit of pollution. Okay? Now, so I'm quoting various philosophers here, and so this one is I'm a big baseball fan, and the future isn't what it used to be because of this. So let me describe some of the reasons why our future is so miserable, and then I'll come back to something. Yeah. The first person to realize our future is miserable in a number of ways was George Orwell, with books he wrote. But he also said, to see what is in front of one's nose requires a constant struggle. Okay? And of course, this is what he meant by it. What this tells us, and what he knew, is that in fact, in a universe that's dominated by the energy of empty space, that energy is gravitationally repulsive. And if it's a constant, what it means is our universe will expand exponentially. That's what that mathematics there says. But more importantly, it says the velocity of objects, and this is the way we rate velocity, is proportional to the distance of objects away from us. The farther objects are away from us, the faster their speed. Okay, fine. But the constant of proportionality is a constant for all time if the energy of empty space is constant. And that means that this number eventually gets bigger than the speed of light. Objects greater than some distance d away from us are now receding from us faster than the speed of light. Now, that's not allowed, right? Well, that's because we lied. Okay? In school we say you can't travel faster than the speed of light, but you have to be like a lawyer and parse it a little more carefully. Okay? Nothing can travel through space faster than the speed of light, But space can do whatever the hell it wants, as far as we know in general relativity. And so space can carry objects away faster than the speed of light. In fact, objects can be standing still and still be moving at the speed of light. You're doing it right now, depending upon how much coffee you had before the lecture. We're not moving very fast at all with respect to the sun, but with respect to an audience trapped in a room in a galaxy in the other end of the visible universe, we're moving away at the speed of light. And that audience is not moving fast relative to their surroundings, but they're moving away from us at the speed of light. How can that be? Well, they're at rest, and we're at rest, but the space between us is expanding. And so, in this case, what this tells us is that objects that are further and further away from us are eventually going faster and faster and faster, and eventually, in fact, will go faster away from us than the speed of light. Space will carry them away faster than the speed of light, and that means we won't be able to see them, because the light won't be able to make it back through space to get to us. We can ask what that distance d is, and if we plug in the energy density in some absurd units of empty space, we find out that that distance is about 18 billion light years. Now, the universe is about 14 billion years old, so this is becoming visible now. This effect is becoming visible. So what will it imply for the future? Okay. Well, what will happen? In astronomy, we talk about redshifts. See, when objects move closer and closer to the speed of light, they won't just disappear. As they get closer to the speed of light, the light from those objects gets stretched, gets redder and redder and redder. That's called redshift. And in fact, if you get to the speed of light, the redshift is infinite. So instead of just disappearing, those objects will get redder and redder and redder and dimmer and dimmer and dimmer until they go sort of twinkle out. And we can ask about the redshift of these objects. And it turns out, if we ask how big is the size of this of the largest region we can see in the universe that's traveling less than the speed of light away from us, compared to the size of the biggest bound object, our local supercluster. Because one of the biggest misconceptions about the expanding universe is that everything's expanding. Okay, it's not. I mean, well, some of us are expanding. But the Earth isn't expanding because it's gravitationally bound. The solar system isn't expanding because it's gravitationally bound. Our galaxy isn't expanding because it's gravitationally bound. The only things that are moving away from us are those things that are not gravitationally bound to us. So if we take the largest bound object we're inside of, maybe our local supercluster, and take the ratio of its size compared to the size of what is the in principle visible universe, it's a factor of 5,000. If we plug in an exponentially expanding universe to that, we can do some calculations. And here's what we find. In merely 150 billion years, which may seem like a long time to some of you, although not long compared to this lecture, it's not long at all. It's really, in fact, in 150 billion years, the universe will look essentially the same. Main sequence stars like our sun will still be burning. There'll be planets that can be around those stars, powered by solar power with elements like our own, so there'll be astronomers and all the rest. But in 150 billion years, the redshift of every object outside of our local supercluster will be at least 5,000. That means the light will be shifted by a factor of 5,000 into the red and infrared, etc. But that won't make them invisible because there's lots of high-frequency radiation. There's X-rays and gamma rays and all the rest, and that'll be shifted into the visible. So they won't be invisible yet. But the great thing about an exponential is it's an exponential. So in merely 2 trillion years, which again is short compared to the lifetime of the longest main sequence stars, the redshift of all objects outside of our local supercluster will exceed 10 to the 53. What does that mean? That means even the highest energy cosmic rays that we now measure today, the highest energy cosmic rays with these big detectors we have, in this case in South America, their wavelength will be redshifted so large that their wavelength will be larger than the size of the observable universe. And that means they're not visible. That means every bit of radiation coming at us from everything outside of our local supercluster will now be invisible. The rest of the universe will have disappeared. Now, I'm an optimist, as it should be clear, and I've tried to turn this into something useful. So I've argued in my country at Congress now, that we should fund cosmology now while we have a chance. There's a problem, however, and that is that there's an impedance match, as we say in physics, mismatch. The long-term future for a congressperson is 2 years, not 2 trillion years, so this doesn't matter. So I haven't been able to convince anyone. But the future is such that the universe will disappear. Okay? Now, so the long-term future is miserable, but I want to show you the short-term future may be miserable. This is already confronting science with problems that are so great that it may end science as we know it. So here's This is a picture that has driven many physicists mad. I'll explain it. This is a brief history of time, if you want. This is the density of all the stuff in the universe as a function of time. This is the density of matter in the universe. It goes down as the universe expands. Density of the universe decreases as the universe expands. But empty space, the energy of empty space, if that's what it is, remains constant over all time. So in this picture, we happen to live right here, when the energy of empty space is about a factor of 3 bigger than the energy of all matter in the universe, including dark matter. But there's something weird about that picture. This is the only time in the history of the universe when these two numbers are about the same. At all early times, the density of matter was much greater than the density of empty space, the energy density. At all late times, the energy density of empty space will be much greater than the energy density of matter. We appear to live at the only time in the history of the universe when these two numbers are about the same. And this is crazy, because the whole idea is we don't live in any particular special time in the universe. Why should 14 billion years after the Big Bang these two numbers be the same when we happen to be around? This is nuts. So some people have come up with an idea for maybe how to explain it. There's that picture. And so to explain it, they look at this picture. And they say there's something in this picture. Galaxies. Maybe that explains why we live when we live. Why? Well, let me just try and show you. Here's the energy of empty space we measure today. But let's imagine that the energy of empty space were slightly larger, say 50 times larger. Then those two curves would cross at that time, right? Well, when's this time? This time is when galaxies first formed. So if the energy of empty space was greater than this, it would dominate over the energy of matter at the time galaxies first formed. But the energy of empty space is gravitationally repulsive. So if it dominated over the energy of matter, galaxies would never have formed. The repulsion would have beat out the attraction. There'd be no galaxies. Maybe this is telling us something. Because if there are no galaxies, then there are no stars. If there are no stars, there are no planets. If there are no planets, there are no astronomers. So some people have argued that maybe that is the explanation. That if, in fact, let's say there are many different universes, and in each different universe, the energy of empty space is a different number, just a random variable. That only in those, when it's not much greater than what we measure, will galaxies form, and then stars and planets and astronomers. So, the universe is the way it is because there are astronomers in it today. It sounds stupid. It may be stupid, but it may be true. And so I do want to come back to Einstein again, because he asked, although in the incorrect way, said the most interesting question to him was whether God, and by God he didn't mean God, had any choice in the creation of the universe. What he meant by this was, are the laws of physics consistent if we change one thing, or is there only one possible universe that could exist, and if I changed one little bit, the whole thing would come apart? He wanted to know if nature was unique, if there's only one physics. And this is really asking the same question, because if there are many different universes and they have different laws of physics and different energy of empty space, then nature isn't unique in some sense. So this is a fundamental question that people are asking now. But worse, particle physicists have begun to ask the question. And particle physicists said, you know what? We're way ahead of everybody else. This is just one number that the astronomers don't understand. We in particle physicists have not understood much more for much longer. And they say, okay, look, there's a lot of things we don't understand. Why is gravity the weakest force in nature? Why is proton 2,000 times heavier than the electron? Why are there 3 generations of elementary particles? Who ordered them? Okay? A whole slew of things. So the particle physicists, some of them said, hey, this is great. You know, maybe we don't have to explain anything. Maybe everything's an environmental parameter. Maybe there's no fundamental quantities. Maybe everything is an environmental accident. And then what you need is not a theory of everything, but rather a theory of anything. And we have such a theory. It's called string theory. So I have a slide here, a brief summary of string theory for those of you who may not know about it. This is one guy says to another, I just had an awesome idea. Suppose all matter and energy is made of tiny vibrating strings. And the second person says, okay, what would that imply? And the first person says, I don't know. Okay, so that's the story of string theory for the last 30 years, in fact. Because it hasn't explained anything. But in fact, it has produced something. And that is this recognition that string theory requires there to be at least 10 or maybe 11 dimensions in nature, most of which we don't see. But if that's true, since we live in a universe with 3 dimensions, and the rest of those dimensions, something must happen to them, and the conventional argument is that they get curled up into regions so small you can't see them. But for every different way of curling up those extra dimensions, you come up with different laws of physics. And so, in fact, string theory provides what's now become called a landscape. Here's a picture of all these extra dimensions curled up in each different way. You end up with each different point in this picture is a different 3-dimensional universe with different laws of physics. And in each universe, maybe the energy of empty space is different, and maybe we live in the valley because that's the right place to be. So string theory does provide that landscape. The question is that the picture of nature? And we don't know. You might ask, of course, if it's really science at all. Because some people have argued that there are possibly 10 to the 500 different possible universes, types of universe that could be the basis of string theory. That means basically it would be consistent with anything you could ever measure. Because somewhere there's a universe with those properties. But if you're consistent with anything you could ever measure, that's not a scientific theory. Because in order to be a scientific theory, you have to be able to falsify it. But if there's nothing you can do to falsify it, it's not science. It's even worse because in order to predict why we might be living here, you have to use probabilities over all of these universes. And there's a big problem with probabilities. I think I drew one of the big problems right there. Namely, that the predictions you make for the universe depend upon what you assume is in the universe. So if you assume that you have a universe that has to result in George Bush, God forbid, then you'll come up with very different predictions for the laws of nature than if you predict a universe that doesn't have him, which would be a better one. Okay, so that's a problem. So, and that's a big debate in science nowadays, and it may change and end the way we think about fundamental physics. In the future, and I'm talking about the very far future, what will astronomers and physicists in the far future on some different galaxy, again, long in the future, far, far away, what will they determine? Well, they'll come up with the same laws of physics we come up with because those laws work. They'll discover electromagnetism and quantum mechanics and all the things we've discovered. They'll build telescopes and they'll look out at the universe and they'll come up with completely the wrong answer. They'll even discover general relativity. But when they look out at the universe with the best equipment they can come up with, they'll come up with the wrong answer because the Big Bang will have disappeared. All evidence for the Big Bang will have disappeared. In fact, they'll come up with the picture that de Sitter had and Einstein had at the turn of the last century. This is our own universe. It's a galaxy. It's not our galaxy. Why? Okay, I want to see if you're still awake. We live in our galaxy. It's the Andromeda Galaxy, but it doesn't matter. Once you've seen one, you've seen them all, more or less. Sorry for the astronomers in the room. But in the far future, that's all we'll have. Because remember, what I'm going to, and I'll just rush through this quickly, basically all evidence for the Big Bang will disappear. All of the fundamental building blocks of the Big Bang that now tell us it really happened will have gone away. The Hubble expansion, the thing that Hubble discovered in 1929, will have disappeared. Why? Because he saw galaxies moving away from us. But in the far future, there won't be any galaxies moving away from us because all the galaxies will have disappeared. So all the galaxies we could use to trace the Hubble expansion will have gone away. Now, in fact, this has a profound implication. There'll be no evidence for dark energy. Because even though in the far future, the density of matter will have gone way down and the dark energy will really be dominant, we won't be able to see it. When the universe is 1 trillion years old, the density of matter compared to the density of dark energy will be 1 part in a million million, meaning matter will be insignificant compared to dark energy. But we won't have any evidence that dark energy exists. Because how do we know dark energy exists? By measuring the acceleration of the universe. But there are no probes to measure the acceleration of the universe. In fact, the only time when you could measure dark energy is right now. When the dark energy density is much smaller than the energy of matter, you can't measure it because it doesn't affect the expansion of the universe. When it's much greater, it's already forced everything to go outside of the horizon and become invisible. So you can't observe it then. Now is the only time we could know dark energy exists. But you say, wait, what about that microwave background that I saw on my TV? Well, it goes away too, for a number of reasons. One, because it turns out as the universe expands, the frequency, the microwave radiation redshifts, and its intensity goes down. So when the universe is about a trillion years old, the intensity of the microwave background will be down by 12 orders of magnitude. Experimentalists will have to be 12 orders of magnitude smarter to find it. Well, that may not be difficult, but still, it turns out that that's not good enough. Because, in fact, in our galaxy, there are free electrons. In fact, in our galaxy, there's a plasma. And when you have a plasma, it's opaque to radiation, I told you. It turns out it's always opaque to radiation smaller than some frequency given by what's called the plasma frequency. We can calculate that number. It's a kilohertz in our galaxy. And that means it turns out when the universe is 50 times its present age, the microwave background will have redshifted to the point that none of the radiation can actually make it into the galaxy. So even if you could build a great experiment, you won't see anything. There'll be no microwave background. Well, you get the idea. It turns out the other big pillar of the Big Bang is the so-called abundance of light elements. Most of the elements in your body, as also says in that little poster out in front, were not created in the Big Bang. They were created in stars. You're all star children. All the oxygen and iron and all the things that make you around was created inside the core of stars, which exploded so that you could be around today. But helium, deuterium, hydrogen, and a little bit of lithium. Lithium's not important. Well, maybe for some of the people in this room it's important, but it's not important in the universe. This is one of the great... I have this as a little pocket slide. Whenever someone tells me there wasn't a Big Bang, I say, look, there was a Big Bang. Because we can predict with the Big Bang what the abundance of these elements should be, because they're created in the Big Bang. And we get 25% of the universe is hydrogen, and roughly 1 part in 10 to the 10th is lithium. It all works perfectly. But stars make helium. Okay? 25% of the universe is helium, not hydrogen. And all the helium essentially we see nowadays, almost all the helium in the universe was created in the Big Bang. But in 1 trillion years from now, it turns out stars will have created enough helium so that 60% of the mass of the universe will be in helium. The component coming from the Big Bang will also have disappeared. There'll be no evidence. There'll be no need for primordial helium production. Stars themselves would have been able to create all of the helium. So every bit of data and theory that you could apply would tell us, when you look out, that the observers in the future will live in an island universe, a single galaxy or metagalaxy, surrounded by an empty universe that isn't expanding, that's static and eternal. The same wrong picture we had 100 years ago. Now, we'll return poetically to that level of ignorance. So I want to end with the good news. The good news is that we live in a very special time. The only time when we can observationally verify that we live in a very special time. Now, what I mean by that is facetious, clearly. It's actually something rather profound. What it really means is that maybe it's true. Maybe that anthropic principle is actually true. Maybe there are no fundamental parameters in the universe and everything is environmental. And that really means that science at a fundamental level will change. So, or maybe even end. And so instead, in fact, I'll leave you with this, that we will be lonely and ignorant, but dominant. And I've been living in the United States for a long time, and I'm very used to that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oops, sorry about that. That was me, folks. I was just called away just at the end of that then. We've just had a major roof leakage. Had to move all the beds and all sorts of capers. Got an old 1890s Victorian terrace, and it has just been so poorly maintained by the council. I'm just completely... amazed that they have the cheek to charge bloody rent for these places. But anyway, the ceiling looks like it's imminently about to cave in, but I shall keep going regardless. There's no point in me stopping anyway. I can't go to bed. There's only room for one on it at the minute. It's all gone like shoved up one end of the had to fold the mattress in half and like move it up away from the water that was dripping in. Anyway, right. Sorry. Oh dear. I'm sorry, Silver Scott. I didn't know how long the dead air had been going for. I suppose a few of you might have nodded off. Right, okay, well, I'll go and stick a tune on because I can't think straight here. Anyway, look, we're probably going to go over the tunes here anyway, but I hope you've enjoyed this evening. Like I say, just a whole bunch of fairly mainstream scientists and thinkers of one sort or another presenting what is quite self-evidently extraordinary evidence that the world isn't quite what we think it is. But still not really quite, the penny's not dropping, is it? You can hear the like I say, from the kind of nervous tremor in their laughs, that they kind of get the implications, but just can't quite go there. You know what I mean? Their scientific paradigm would need to shift just too far to the left to be able to contemplate what their own evidence is presenting in front of their eyes. But anyway, like I say, maybe we can assemble a better model between ourselves. Yes, I know, I'm back on, yes. I was upstairs sorting out my bloody leaky roof. Piss off. Right, anyway, back to some tunes.